Rob's gaze did not waver. Now King Robert is dead, or near enough, and my father is a captive of the Lannisters. Those who made that vow are not here, so the consequences of it cannot be enforced. Theon exhaled sharply, relief flashing across his face. Then Robb, I swear, I had no part in this. I did not know. I know, Robb said, a small, reassuring smile briefly flashing across his face. But your father does not care if you live or die. He's raised the Iron Fleet again, and he's done it knowing full well what it means for you. Theon flinched as though struck. His eyes dropped to his hands, fingers tightening and loosening in his lap. After a moment, he spoke in a hoarse whisper. Would he have done it? Robb frowned. What? Theon lifted his head, his expression raw and uncertain. Your father. Would he have killed me? Robb hesitated. He thought of his father and the sense of honor that he carried himself with. He raised you under his roof for 10 years, Robb said at last. What do you think? Theon swallowed. No, he said, after a long pause. No, he would not have. I did not always embody it, but he sought to instill in me the virtues of justice and compassion. Robb nodded once. He would not punish a son for his father's sins. Let me make this right. Let me go to the Iron Islands and speak with my father and my kin. They will listen to me. I can make them see reason. Robb's eyes narrowed. You have been gone from the islands half your life. Do you truly think they will see you as one of them? I have to try, Theon said quickly. Winterfell's been my home since I was a boy. Your father treated me better than my own ever did. Let me prove where my loyalty lies. The silence that followed stretched long. The Wolfsguard watched quietly, stone-faced. I cannot in good conscience send you to your father. It would look like I was rewarding him for raiding my lands and harming my people. Then let me go north. I will speak with the Ironborn who are raiding our shores. At last, Robb leaned back in his chair. I am going to have Lord Bolton send 1,500 men from Harrenhal to reinforce the north. You will ride with Owen and Sir Pewin to command them. You can give the Ironborn the chance to return to their ships and leave, but if they refuse, you must do what any man of the north would do. Theon blinked, surprise flickering across his face. You are trusting me with men. You have been just as much a brother to me as Jon, and I am trusting that my faith in you is not misplaced, Robb replied. But do not think of this as a reward. If we thought it would be difficult for Northmen to follow a Greyjoy before, it might be near impossible now. In truth, Robb wanted to send more than the 1,500 men, and he wanted to be the one who led them, to put to the sword those who sought to harm his lands and people. But to leave now when the advantage was his, to take away such a large amount of his army that was meant to be keeping Tywin Lannister out of the Riverlands proper, it would undo everything he had fought for up to this point. For a moment, Theon looked as though he might say something more, but then he only nodded, his mouth set in a tight line. Theon bowed his head once more, then turned to leave. The heavy oaken door creaked open, the sound loud in the stillness. For a heartbeat he paused at the threshold, as if hoping Robb might call him back, offer a word of reassurance, or even forgiveness. But none came. When the door shut behind him, the silence that followed was heavier than before. Owen Norrie was the first to speak. My prince, you trust him? Robb leaned forward, elbows on the desk, fingers steepled beneath his chin. I trust that he believes what he says, he said quietly. But I also know since we were boys that Theon has been eager for glory and recognition. I fear what might happen if he thinks he can get them with the Ironborn. That's not the most reassuring thought, said Sir Raynaud. No, it is not, Robb agreed. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Sir Pewin shifted his weight near the door, his brow furrowed. What happens if the son decides blood runs thicker than friendship? Robb's jaw tightened. I believe it will not come to that, but if Theon turns his cloak, then he will have chosen his fate. And the North will answer. Sir Robar Royce cleared his throat. What would Lord Eddard have done? He would have given him a chance, Robb said after thinking it over. The next morning broke cold and grey. Theon stood beside his horse, checking the saddle straps one last time. He was to ride out with Owen Norrie and Sir Pewin free to meet the men marching from Harrenhal. They'd be Senites behind, but on horseback they would close the distance before reaching the neck. "Take this," Rob said, handing him a folded parchment sealed with his direwolf sigil. "A signed order, naming you commander of the host. Men are quicker to obey a seal than a word, especially when the word comes from a Greyjoy." Theon accepted the letter with a nod, the corner of his mouth twitching at the half-insult, half-truth. Before he left, Rob gestured Oliver forward. His squire held out a pair of dented steel gauntlets painted grey and gold. "These were taken from a Lannister knight at Oxcross. You once told me that your father and uncles believe the Ironborn should take what they desire by strength alone, that nothing worth having comes as a gift. Well, these were paid for with the iron price." Theon turned them over in his hands, testing the weight. "Was it one I killed?" Rob gave a short laugh. "Do you think I was so unbothered by the knights trying to kill me that I could watch which man your sword cut?" Theon's lips curved into his familiar half-smirk, but it lacked its old arrogance. His eyes, when he looked up, held something quieter. "You have killed your share of Lannisters," Rob continued, his tone softening. "Whether these came from one of them or not matters little." Theon said nothing, looking down at the gauntlets again. A moment of silence passed between them. It never used to be like this. Even when Rob came back from his fostering, and distance had grown between them, there were not these awkward pauses as both struggled to find the right words. "You do not have to do this," Rob said quietly. "You have nothing to prove to me." "I am not doing this for you," Theon said, lifting his chin. "I am doing it for the North." "Then be smart about it," Rob said after a pause. "You have learned enough of war from me, from my father, and from Sir Roderick to know how to lead men. Use that. Do not let pride rule your judgment." Theon nodded curtly and slipped the gauntlets onto his hands. "They fit well enough. I'll bring you good news when next you hear from me." They embraced for a few seconds before Rob stepped back and allowed Theon to swing into his saddle in one smooth movement. Theon nodded at him before urging his horse forward and through the Golden Tooth's gates. He was followed by Owen and Sir Pewin. Before they slipped through the gates, Owen and Sir Pewin looked back and gave him their own curt nods. But while Theon's was in goodbye, the two Wolfsguard were nodding to show Rob that he could trust in them. That if Theon should turn his cloak, that they would do what was necessary. Rob prayed to the old gods that it did not come to that. 3 Senites later, Rob arrived at Sarsfield with 15,000 rivermen at his back. Like the Golden Tooth, he found Sir Mark had kept the castle in good order. He treated Sir Hoare and his family with respect and dignity, even if he restricted their freedoms within their own castle. He also found a reply waiting for him from King's Landing. A letter from Tyrion Lannister of all people, who was acting as hand of the king while his father was, otherwise predisposed as the man wrote. In tight, looping handwriting, Rob read that an exchange of prisoners was agreeable. The imp acknowledged that they did hold Lord Deari, his wife, and his son, as prisoners in King's Landing. The offer was Jaime Lannister, Willem Lannister, Lord Quinton Bainfort, and Sir Tytos Brax, the new Lord of Hornvale, in exchange for Rob's father and the Dearis. Rob thought a lord, who could fight and wage war, for a lady, even one of noble birth, was an ill trade. He wrote back agreeing to the first 3 but that instead of Sir Tytos he would exchange either Lady Westerling or the Squire Shenfrey for Lady Deari. He had the letter sent and let Sir Mark know that should they receive a reply, to send it to him with the fastest rider in Sarsfield. Oxcross, or rather the passage through the mountains that started just east of Oxcross, was well defended. Trees were few and far between in the area, so there was no palisade wall built, but what few trees were felled were turned into a row of stakes, placed in front of a deep dug trench, which has 3 other lines of trenches dug behind it, one after the other. The path through them had one walking in a zigzag between the gaps. It was well done and he praised both Sir Ryman and Sir Walton for their diligence and skill. While they appeared to be wary of the defensive work and the small host of Freys, the small folk of Oxcross outright scattered in fear at the sight of Rob's host. Though their own homes had been spared in the massacre of Oxcross, they still remembered the field of corpses left behind and the stench of Westerland dead that had lingered for weeks. Once past Oxcross, when they marched into the Westerlands proper, Rob split the force. 8,000 rivermen went south under the command of Lord Piper, to storm the keeps of Clegane Hall, Cornfield, and Cricket Hall. Another 2,000 were sent north under Lord Goodbrook, to reinforce those already raiding up there, and giving them enough numbers to start taking keeps by force. He told both lords that they had a moon's turn to get their fill, to storm keeps and take their revenge for what was done to their lands and people. He asked they spare the small folk as best they could, as Rob thought it will to punish the commoners for the atrocities committed by their kin forced to fight at the orders of a lord. And at the end of that moon's turn, he would gather the rivermen and northerners who raised the Westerlands, and he would sack Lannisport. The remaining 5,000, which Rob took charge of, encamped between the city and Casterly Rock, to keep the Lannister strongholds hemmed in. Rob realized that Tywin Lannister would never pay the Riverlands what was owed to it. If they wanted reparations, they had to take it from his vassals in livestock, jewelry, coin, and gold. In this way the Lannisters' vassals would pay the Lion's debts. On the first day, Rob set the men to work. Most were ordered to dig trenches while others scoured the nearby hills for what little timber could be found to carve into stakes. The northern Westerlands were a mountainous region with rocky soil. It was a land rich in gold, copper, and tin, but not in farmland or forest. Those could be found in the southern Westerlands, where the mountains shrunk into hills before the ground leveled as it stretched into the low-lying farmlands of the Reach. The second day a group rode out from Lannisport under a white flag, asking to speak with whoever led the host camped near their walls. Rob went out to greet them, surrounded by the members of the Wolfsguard that still rode with him, Sir Humphrey, Sir Reynaud, Sir Robar, Morgan Liddell, and Hoarfrost Umber. Leading them was Grey Wind, who bounded ahead of their horses, head swiveling this way and that as he took in the new sights and smells around him. Grey Wind's presence caused the Westerland horses to whinny and stomp about in unease as their riders fought to get them under control. There were 30 men dressed in the red and gold armor of House Lannister of Lannisport. They were like the Karstarks or the long-dead Greystocks, an offshoot of the main branch founded by a second or third son hundreds of years ago. Yet unlike in the north, where new names were forged, the southern houses clung to their heritage, like the Fossoes of New Barrel, or the Danes of High Hermitage. Rob could guess who was in charge of the Lannisport riders by his looks. The man had the features of a Lannister, though they appeared dull, golden hair that did not shine as bright, green eyes that were more seaweed than emerald, and similar facial features that looked more plain than comely. He looked, Rob thought, like a lesser echo of the Kingslayer. He would learn the man's name was Ser Gerard Lannister, heir to Jason Lannister, Lord of Lannisport. Ser Gerard's tone was courteous enough, though his gaze flicked between the direwolf and the men at Rob's back before settling on Rob himself. "Lord Stark," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "For what reason does your host make camp so near our walls?" Rob regarded him coolly, answering with one curt word. "War. The people of this city are merchants and fishermen. It is not them who wages war against you." Rob's expression did not change. "The people of the Riverlands did not wage war either," he said, voice quiet but edged with steel. "They tilled their fields, raised their children, and paid their taxes until lions rode through their villages to put them to the sword and burned their homes to ash." Ser Gerard's jaw tightened, lips pressing into a thin line. "Repay every sin with sin, and soon none are left to seek the Father's mercy." This time Rob's expression did change, as a feral grin split across his face. "I am a follower of the old gods, Ser Gerard. And in the north, we have a saying, blood calls for blood, and the gods always answer. You have regard for your small folk, that is better than many nobles I have met. But Tywin Lannister cares little and less for them, nor for anything but his pride, I think. I offered Tywin Lannister peace, asking only that he release my father and repay the Riverlands for the death and destruction he has wrought. His response? To offer nothing and demand everything. And so the innocent must suffer for what you claim is Lord Lannister's pride. When the lords play their games and wage their wars, it is the small folk who suffer." Ser Gerard's jaw tightened, and though his words had been courteous, his eyes betrayed the resentment simmering beneath. He saw there would be no persuading Rob. With a sharp tug of the reins, he turned his horse about, galloping back toward Lannisport. His knights followed in silence, their banners rippling behind them. Rob watched them go, his expression unreadable, though Grey Wind let out a low rumble that broke the stillness. Beyond the distant walls, Lannisport glittered in the afternoon light with its golden roofs and harbour thick with masts. For all its beauty, it was a lion's den, and Rob meant to see it caged. "What are your orders, my lord?" asked Sir Humphrey, his voice low and steady behind him. Robb did not turn. His gaze stayed fixed upon the city. "Set patrols and outriders," he said. "I want no surprises. No gaps in the watch. I want riders on every road that leads to the rock and to the city both. Nothing moves without us knowing." He drew a slow breath, his tone cold. "No grain, no salt, no coin or wine reaches them by land. If they wish to eat, let them beg the sea for their supper." Chapter 50, Stannis II. Stannis II. Stannis wasted no time settling the last of his affairs in the Stormlands. He received the remaining oaths of fealty from those lords who had not been at the Battle of Storm's End, of those who sent others to fight in their stead, or had become lord after their father had perished in the fighting. He took their pledges in the great hall, before the carved stag that crowned the hearth. Some bent the knee with trembling lips, others with defiance glinting behind their eyes, but Stannis cared for neither fear nor flattery. Oathbreakers would not find mercy in his court. Once their allegiance was sworn, he saw that his lady wife and daughter were brought from Dragonstone and installed within the thick, sea-washed walls of Storm's End under heavy guard. Garrisoning the castle was a force strong enough to hold it against any who might think to test his rule, commanded by Sir Gendry Faring and reinforced by a dozen ships along the coast. Marching to the west and south, a force 4,000 strong, put in the hands of the loyal Lord Beric Dondarrion, was left to guard the Boneway from any possible incursion by the Dornish. Dondarrion's own keep, Blackhaven, oversaw the passage through the mountains one must take once crossing the Boneway. Only when all was in order did Stannis turn his eyes northward toward King's Landing, and the Iron Throne that should be his. Before his armies departed from Storm's End, Melisandre had stood beside him before the great brazier that burned within the hall, her red robes shimmering in the light of the fire. "I have seen it in the flames, your grace," she said. "As you take the city, a clash between lion and wolf beneath walls the color of a maiden's blush. Both shall bleed, both shall roar, yet neither shall fall." The meaning had seemed plain enough. If the Lannisters and Starks were to tear at each other beneath the walls of Maidenpool, far from the capital, it would serve him well. A great battle in the Riverlands, upon the shores of the Bay of Crabs, would sap their strength, leaving fewer foes for him to face after he took the city. Could Tywin Lannister stand up to him with thousands less men? Would Robb Stark dare to continue to defy him with thousands fewer behind him? The thought of such discord among his enemies pleased him, though he did not smile. Victory, he had learned long ago, was not in omens or prayers, it was in numbers, in discipline, and in the will to see the thing done. But on the night his vanguard reached the point where the King's Road met the Rosa Road, a mere senight's march from King's Landing, the fires burned differently. When Melisandre looked upon them, the vision had changed. The lion and the wolf were gone, the pink walls vanished into smoke. It was as if the fates themselves had rewritten the future. The Stark boy no longer held Tywin Lannister at bay. Stannis watched her long in silence as the Red Priestess stared into the flames, the reflection of fire dancing in her eyes. This was also plain for him to see. Without the Northmen to occupy him, Tywin would be free to march south, free to bring his banners to King's Landing. And if the lion reached the capital before him, all his careful plans might come undone. An extra 15,000 men to reinforce the city would tip the odds decidedly against Stannis. Even the best laid plans would be unable to overcome such numbers while storming a walled settlement. Stannis ordered the march redoubled. His men rose before dawn and marched until after nightfall, their boots striking the ground in grim rhythm. Discipline held, but he could feel the exhaustion in their movements, hear it in their labored breaths. He drove them harder still. Mercy, he told himself, was a luxury for lesser men. 2 days from King's Landing, his scouts brought word of an encampment hidden deep within the Kingswood. There, beneath the tangled canopy, lay the men from Bitterbridge who now marched under his flag, a host of some 18,000. Half bore the banners of the Reach, the other half those of the Stormlords who had once followed Renly. Stannis rode through their ranks that evening as the sun set over the woods, his face unreadable as ever. Men straightened as he passed, eyes following the stern figure on the tall black destrier. Melisandre's red eyes glimmered beside him in the torchlight, her presence unsettling even the most hardened knights. The air smelled of smoke and pine and destiny. "The way is open, your grace," Lord Caron said, riding behind him. Stannis did not reply at first. He was staring north, toward the city held by a boy who was no kin of his. "Then we march," he said. At dawn, Stannis' host broke camp and began its march toward King's Landing. The men moved in steady columns, the clatter of armor and creak of wagon wheels echoing through the woods. By mid-morning, the outriders who had ridden hard for the coast returned, their horses lathered and their faces streaked with dirt. They reported seeing Stannis' fleet gathered at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, its sails furled against the wind. Dozens of warships floated in the churning waters of Blackwater Bay, their masts proudly flying the crowned stag of House Baratheon. From the middle of the column, siege engines rumbled forward, the same catapults and trebuchets that had been built for Storm's End, though ineffective they would have been against the Great Keep's massive walls, now bound for the walls of King's Landing. Behind them came the wagons of freshly hewn ladders, made each night as the army camped within the Kingswood. Only a small host would cross the bridge spanning the Blackwater Rush, a span of stone and timber that led directly to the Mudgate. The ground between the city wall and the river was little more than a strip of churned mud, scarcely wide enough for a few hundred men to form ranks or maneuver. Any greater number would only choke the approach and make easy targets for the archers and scorpions atop the battlements. A handful of catapults were positioned on the river's southern bank, trained on the scorpions mounted on the walls, and the gatehouse, to batter them with stones while the assault began. When the signal came, men would rush the ladders to scale the walls, hoping to divide the defenders' attention. The main strength of his army would cross the river farther upstream, at a shallow ford Stannis himself remembered from his years in King's Landing, found long ago on one of Robert's drunken hunts through the Kingswood. There, the host could spread out and strike a broader stretch of the city's southern walls, between the King's Gate and the Lion's Gate. His trebuchets and remaining catapults would pound a chosen section of wall until it broke, while his infantry advanced behind their shields, rams and ladders in hand. A third force, 3,000 strong, would come by water. Once he felt enough of the defenders had been committed to the southern defenses, he would give the signal, a black flag waving from the shore. The transport barges would approach as close as they could to the shoreline north of the city, before the soldiers were rowed ashore. There they would storm the Iron Gate, forcing the city's defenders to fight on two fronts. "Signal the men to start," Stannis said, voice like iron as he gazed out at King's Landing. Besides him, Lord Buckler turned and gestured, which in turn led to someone else farther back turning and gesturing. Then a horn sounded, deep and loud, reverberating in Stannis' ears. It was soon joined by another, and then another, until the very air seemed to tremble. It was time to take the throne that was rightfully his. The remnants of the fleet left to the Pretender, commanded by captains of the royal fleet whose loyalty was not to Stannis, lay moored along the river, their hulls rocking idly beside the docks outside the Mudgate. Through his spyglass Stannis saw no motion upon their decks. There were no sailors, no signal flags, and no hint of readiness. Perhaps the defenders had been caught unawares, their men ashore and drunk in the city's taverns. It would show just how unfit the boy king was, to lose the Blackwater before they even knew they were under attack. Beside him, and against his command, Melisandre observed the field with the unshakable calm of someone who had commanded armies into battle before. "Victory is certain, your grace," she said softly. "You are Azor Ahai reborn, the prince that was promised. The flames have shown me your triumph." But in the moons the Red Priestess had been in his service, Stannis had watched her closely enough to know her well. Beneath her composure lingered something he had never seen before, a flicker of doubt in her red eyes. Perhaps her fires had gone dark on this day. Let her have her doubts, for he had none. Below, the only movement on the river was a small barge drifting aimlessly downstream, turning in the current as it passed between the larger hulls of the Lannister ships. It was drifting to the mouth of the river, where Stannis' fleet, under Sir Imry Florent, was pushing forward in disciplined ranks. Sir Imry's flagship signalled an all-out order to advance, into the mouth of the Blackwater. And the bulk of the fleet was following his lead. The only ships not following the command, besides the transport barges that had their own mission, were the 30 ships under the command of Sir Davos and those belonging to the Lysani pirate, Saladhor Saren. Stannis frowned. He would have to talk with both Sir Imry and Sir Davos after the battle was over. While he disagreed with Sir Imry's decision to send all of the ships sailing into the rush, thinking it overkill, and he would make sure to let his good brother know of such, Sir Davos was second in command. He could not have leaders in his armies and fleets choosing to not follow the orders of a superior. Great armies were disciplined. Disobeying orders was the opposite of discipline. Then the battle began in earnest, and such thoughts became secondary concerns. Catapults hurled their stones at the mud gate, their crashing impact lost in the rising chorus of screams and the thunder of drums. Men rushed forward beneath ladders and shields, arrows streaking down to cut them apart. In only minutes dozens of bodies lay strewn across the mud before the walls, some dead and others wishing they were. And then silence. It came like the breath before a storm, as if the very air had been pulled from the sky. A heartbeat later came the sound, whoosh. A plume of emerald fire erupted from the drifting barge, blooming across the water like the mouth of some great beast. Wildfire. The explosion swallowed the nearest ships, his and theirs alike. Flames rolled across the water, clinging to wood and flesh. Men leapt screaming from decks only to be consumed midair, their cries echoing over the water. Ships further downstream tried to reverse course, but many of them were too close to the fire, and those that were not were too late. Stannis saw a giant chain was being raised across the mouth of the river, connected to what looked like newly built towers on each bank. Such a chain was normally used to keep ships out of a harbor, but the Lannisters were using it to keep his ships in, unable to escape the spreading inferno. For a long, terrible moment, the battle stilled. Even the defenders upon the wall ceased their volleys, transfixed by the spreading fire that devoured everything it touched. The docks went next, along with the merchant cogs, the fishing boats, even the skiffs of the riverfolk. The smoke turned the sky black. The screams reached him even through the din of war, excruciating, wretched, primal screams. Stannis knew he would hear them until his dying day. Someone nearby was shouting at the ships, and it took a moment for Stannis to realize he was the one shouting, his voice raw and hoarse. Beach the ships. Get them to shore. Abandon ship. It was the only way to escape the wildfire, which the current was carrying down the river and would eventually slip between the chains and into the bay beyond. On the shores at the edge of the Kingswood, his catapults turned their aim from the city walls to the narrow towers that held the chain. Stones smashed into the structures, shattering brick and timber. He would commend the one who issued that change in orders for their quick thinking. On land, the assault began anew, soldiers becoming too deep in battle to remember the flames behind them. Your Grace. Sir Roland Storm called, his voice strained. The young knight, one of the king's men sworn to Stannis, stood waiting for command. Shall we send the signal to the transports? Stannis blinked, remembering himself. Send it. Sir Roland bowed and sprinted off to do just that. Stannis hoped the transports out at sea would be able to see the signal through the smoke that hung heavy over the field of battle. Or that the captains of the transports had not fled in fear of the wildfire. At that moment, Melisandre drifted from his side, as if in a trance. My lady! Sir Justin Massey cried, stepping towards her as if to restrain her. She raised a hand, and the knight froze where he stood. Her other arm stretched toward the flames, eyes closed, lips moving soundlessly in a prayer, no doubt beseeching her Lord of Light. The wildfire shifted. Slowly, impossibly, the tide of green flame began to move, not downriver toward the bay, but toward the city walls. Stannis watched in disbelief as the inferno crawled up the banks and across the muddy tract of land, closer to King's Landing, pushed by unseen hands. His men, those still attempting to scale the walls by the mudgate, fled the flames' path. Except not all escaped. Those who did not screamed as the heat melted steel and flesh alike. The wildfire licked at the stone walls of the capital, blackening them. The heat was so intense it made the air ripple. For a moment, Stannis could only watch her, her crimson robes whipping about her as if caught in an unseen gale. Against all reason the wildfire obeyed her command. The green tide bent toward the walls, as if Arla himself had reached from the heavens to corral it. Perhaps she truly did draw her strength from some god. Perhaps her flames and visions were more than trickery and shadow. But Stannis Baratheon was not a man to put faith before duty. Whatever powers the Red Woman wielded, they would not win this battle alone. His men were dying by the hundreds, and there were still gates to break, walls to climb, and a city to take. A new commotion rippled through the chaos, a cry of warning, followed by the clash of steel. From a sally port by the King's Gate poured a fresh sortie, a knight in a gleaming white cloak leading men at arms in golden armor. Kingsguard. They rushed through the smoke and mud, cutting down the men who bore his rams before they could bring them to the gates. Kingsguard Stannis growled, pointing with his sword. On me. He spurred his horse forward, riding toward the fight. Around him his knights followed, Sir Gyard Morrigan, Sir Gerald Gower, Sir Andrew Estermont, and a score more. A bolt from a scorpion struck the rider next to him, sending man and horse both tumbling to the ground. The men of the sortie carved through the disordered lines of Stormlanders until Stannis himself struck their flank. The fight was close and vicious, men hacking at arm's length in the ever-thickening of the smoke. Steel clanged on steel, hooves churned mud, and the cries of the wounded were lost beneath the thunder of battle. Stannis caught sight of the White Knight, his open-faced helm adorned with a white dagger. Sir Philip Foote, he recalled, recognizing the knight from his times at King's Landing, during the visits when the knight was seeking glory in the various tournaments Robert held. He could not recall the man ever advancing far in the lists or melees. Foote charged, shouting some prayer to the Seven, his long sword aimed for Stannis's midsection. Stannis raised his sword to meet the blow. Before their blades could meet, Sir Andrew Estermont, unhorsed during the fighting, intercepted the Kingsguard, their swords locking. The younger man twisted, wrenched, and drove his own blade through the joint in the Kingsguard's armor beneath the arm. Foote gasped, the breath leaving him in a wet rattle as he toppled forward, his white cloak darkening with blood and mud. The sight rallied Stannis's men. Forward, he shouted, his voice raw. Drive them back to their gates. They surged ahead, shields locking, blades flashing. The sortie broke. Those not slain turned tail, running for the safety of the sally port. A score more were cut down before arrows falling from atop the battlements forced Stannis's men to retreat out of range. The field before the gate was a ruin of bodies, blooded, trampled, and broken. Stannis withdrew to higher ground, breath hard, armor splattered with mud and soot. More men rushed forward to pick up the ram and renew the attempts to break through the gates. Stannis allowed himself to catch his breath. Men climbed the ladders as fast as their armor and swords would allow. There were pockets of fighting on the walls, but it was not enough. Then a new noise cut through the din. A deep, grinding crack. One of the slender towers anchoring the great chain across the black water shuddered, groaned, and collapsed in on itself under the relentless barrage of catapult stones. The massive chain sagged, part of it vanishing beneath the surface of the river with a metallic shriek. "Look there!" Sir Gerald cried, pointing with his gauntleted hand. Downstream, ships that had been trapped by the wildfire and the chain were surging toward the gap, their oars churning the black water. The current carried them free, their crews rowing with desperate vigor. Stannis allowed himself the briefest nod. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. He turned back to Melisandre and froze. She had collapsed where she stood, her crimson robes pooled around her like spilled blood. Smoke swirled about her, her hands twitching weakly as if clutching for something unseen. The moment her eyes rolled back, the wildfire's unnatural current faltered. Then, slowly, terribly, the green fire began to drift once more with the flow of the river. At first, it was subtle, but soon the current took hold, carrying the burning slick downstream. The flames lapped again at the ships who had yet to be free from the river. Some escaped into the bay, their sails blackened but intact. Others were not so fortunate. The wildfire touched their hulls, and they were enclosed in emerald fire. Those horrifying screams filled the air again, carried over the water by the wind. Stannis stood rooted, jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "Get her away from the river," he ordered at last, his voice a rasp. "See that she lives." Two of his men lifted Melisandre's limp form, bearing her back toward the command tents set on the other side of the black water in the Kingswood as the light of the wildfire painted the night sky green. Stannis watched the flames consume the ships, his face hard and unreadable. The river was a burning hellscape. The screams on the river faded into a dull roar, the wildfire's eerie glow casting long shadows across the battle. Stannis turned from the sight of his burning ships, his expression was the same as ever, resolute and unyielding. The battle was not yet lost. The thunder of war filled the air. The catapults that had knocked down the tower and freed the trapped ships, turned their assault back to the Mudgate. Smoke from the burning river still clung to the sky, and the smell of pitch, oil, and blood hung thick enough to taste. At the King's Gate, the fighting had grown brutal. Every step forward was paid for in dead men. Thrice Stannis had ordered the rams forward, and thrice his men had been driven back by cascades of boiling oil and falling stone. But his soldiers would not break. The fourth assault came from above. A handful of knights, their armor blackened and dented, fought their way up the ladders and over the walls. Their shields took the brunt of the arrows and oil, their swords found the gaps in enemy mail. Stannis watched from below as the banner of the crowned stag, half burned but still flying, crested the parapet. The fighting atop the walls was fierce and desperate, men grappling and stabbing in close quarters. At last, the defenders broke. "The gatehouse is ours," came the cry from above. Moments later, the murder holes went silent. No more oil fell. The hands that had hurled stones down at them were gone. Then, with a grinding of chains and iron, the portcullis began to rise. "Forward!" Stannis shouted. "Now, before they can bar it again." The men with the ram surged ahead. They were covered in soot and blood, but the sound of the portcullis lifting filled them with new strength. The ram smashed into the heavy oak doors. At the mud gate, the bombardment continued. Stannis's catapults shattered the upper stonework of the gatehouse. One corner of the great structure gave way with a grinding crash, half burying the portcullis beneath rubble. The gate itself sagged inward, its iron bands warped and its hinges splintered, but it held for now. Farther north, the siege engines trained on the section of wall near the Lion's Gate had done their work well. Stone after stone had smashed into the same section of wall until the mortar gave way. A large section of the face of the wall crumbled with a thunderous roar, sending dust and debris cascading into the ground below. A jagged wound but not a full breach. The sun had already passed its zenith and was beginning its slow descent into the western horizon. They had been at it for a few hours already, and it would likely take a few hours more, but the city would be Stannis by nightfall. He could feel it deep in the pit of his gut. At the King's Gate, the ram crashed into the wooden doors again and again. Dozens of times the heavy wooden doors shook as Stannis' men in the gatehouse above it fought to the death to hold the room. And then with a crack the doors burst inwards in a shower of splinters. The ram was dropped to the ground and the men holding it rushed the breach. Swords flashed, spears thrust, and the ground ran red. His commanders sent more soldiers at the King's Gate, knights and men at arms who wore plated armor and could push against the thrust of spears. Slowly, as more Stormlanders and Reachmen poured through the broken doors, the defenders fell back, too few to hold against the tide. From his vantage point near the King's Gate, Stannis saw the breaches beginning to form. The King's Gate was enough for now, but if the defenders were smart they would set up barricades and ambushes in the nearby, narrow streets. Not to mention, if the gatehouse was taken from his men and the portcullis closed again, his soldiers in the city would be cut off from reinforcements. More breaches were required. The siege engines were to keep firing without pause. If they lacked stone, then the rubble already torn from the walls would serve. The city would be brought down by its own protection. "Secure the gate," he ordered. "Hold it for all that you're worth. No man retreats. No one flees. This city will be ours." Chapter 51, Tyrion 7. Tyrion 7. A thorough examination of the latest Raven scrolls from his father, mixed with reports whispered by Varys Littlebirds and the blunt assessments of the more seasoned commanders in the city, gave Tyrion a grimly coherent picture of their predicament. Numbers, cold and merciless, had a way of stripping away disillusionment and false hope. Even with every gold cloak, every sworn sword of the Crown lands, and every male old enough to carry a spear and be called a soldier within the Westerlands, the forces loyal to Joffrey were at best equal to those of either the Robb Stark or Stannis Baratheon. Equal numbers were not enough when one needed to defeat both foes. Worse still, if the Starks chose to back Stannis' claim, which seemed a likely outcome if Ned Stark found himself leading the northern armies again. It had been during one of their increasingly tense small council meetings that Varys had come into the chamber, talking in that voice of his that somehow sounded both low and high-pitched. It seemed the Master of Whispers had been sitting on bits and pieces of information, waiting for the entire story to be caught in his web before passing it along. Renly's former host, he announced, hands folded primly within his sleeves, has split. 23,000 have joined Lord Stannis, the rest of the Stormlords and a handful of Reach Lords who bent the knee after Renly's unfortunate passing. A few hundred are prisoners of Stannis, kept between Storm's End and Dragonstone. Thousands more are walking home without horse, arms, or armor. Tyrion remembered the way Cersea's eyes had narrowed at that, suspicion and frustration her two most prevailing emotions these past few nights. She wanted enemies neatly labeled and easily crushed. Varys dealt in maybes. His sister hated maybes. But that still leaves nearly 55,000 men unpledged. Varys continued. Most of them the infantry left behind as Renly sought to fight his brother beneath their ancestral seat, the rest the cavalry that fled the disastrous battle. The Tyrells had not pledged to support Stannis, nor had the Redwynes, Hightowers, Rowans, or Tarlis. The strength and wealth of the Reach was still available to be wooed, and Tyrion was determined to court them. Littlefinger had made sure he was the first to offer his services, draping them in honeyed words and promises. "Send me," Littlefinger had said, with practiced modesty. "Give me a free hand to negotiate, and I will win the Reach for the Iron Throne. I will do this, in the name of my king, and ask only that my efforts be recognized." What he meant, of course, was, let me tie half the Reach to my personal influence, and lavish me in gold and titles for doing so. Tyrion had smiled pleasantly, declined, and made very sure Littlefinger saw the lack of trust behind the courtesy. In Tyrion's eyes, Petyr Baelish was the worst kind of man to have in one's court, an overly ambitious man. Instead he had chosen the Master of Laws, Lord Riker, steady and humorless, a man Cersei barely noticed. Varys provided the last known movements of the Tyrell host, moving west of Bitterbridge. After the meeting, well away from his sister's listening ears and the flattering sycophants who he knew served her, Tyrion had informed Lord Riker of their biggest offer to the Tyrells, a proposed marriage between Joffrey and Margaery. If Riker could secure it, the Reach would be wooed indeed. Mace Tyrell had been dreaming of marrying his daughter to a king since the girl was born. It was only right they grant the man his wish. And as for Littlefinger, Tyrion needed him somewhere useful where his ambition could be pointed at a distant target, somewhere away from King's Landing to limit the man's growing influence. The Vale had been silent since the war began. Lysa Arryn refused to stir from her mountain fortress, unmoved by the sufferings of her homeland or her siblings. She would not lift a finger to help her family. But perhaps she would stir for a childhood friend, one who boasted on multiple occasions to have the heart of both Tully sisters, as well as their maiden blood if the man was to be believed. Tyrion did not believe him, but he remembered Lysa Arryn and believed in her gullibility. Between the small council meetings, the political games that were played throughout the Red Keep, and preparing the city for a siege, he had contemplated his brief exchanges with Robb Stark about a trading of prisoners. Tyrion had recognized the strategy at once, for it was one he had learned from his own father, and he himself would have employed, a reminder of the many hostages held by the North, a quiet assertion of leverage, and a request to send all replies to Sarsfield, an indication that the length of the river road through the mountains of the west, land belonging to the Lannisters, lay in Stark and Tully hands. He had contemplated the exchange because of what Ned Stark knew, that Jaime and Cersei were lovers. That Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were not Baratheons born of King Robert but Waters born of brother and sister. The more Tyrion pondered it, the more he realized he himself had always known of their relationship. Not consciously, perhaps, but instinctively, in that deep place where a man stores the knowledge he fears to examine directly. He had ignored the signs, not out of love for Cersei, he could not care less for his sister. He ignored it for Jaime's sake, one of the few in Tyrion's family to not treat him like an inconvenience, and the only one to love him unconditionally. Once free, with that knowledge in mind, Ned Stark would never bend the knee to Joffrey. He would continue the North and Riverlands rebellion, and given the man's sense of honor and duty, would likely support Stannis' claim as Robert's legitimate heir. Yet if they kept that man prisoner, or gods forbid they reached the point where Joffrey's arrogance and cruelty became too much for Tyrion and Cersei to keep in check, and Lord Stark was executed, the war would continue regardless. At this point, no matter what happened with Ned Stark, the only way to bring the North and Riverlands back under the Iron Throne would be with bloodshed. They would have to beat them both into submission, take hostages to be raised in King's Landing and Casterly Rock, and force daughters of keeps vacant of a male heir to marry loyal second and third sons of Westerland houses. So in the end, Tyrion thought one night, poring over the maps and letters again by candlelight, whether Ned Stark lives or dies, the war does not end. And if the war would not end, then at the very least, he would have his brother back. Except things had to be put on hold when scouts returned at a gallop, reporting cavalry in the Kingswood 2 days' ride from the Mudgate. Outriders for Stannis, unmistakably. A small taste of the larger host that would follow, the vanguard first, the core of the army soon after. The time for letters and schemes had come to an end. Steel, fire, and numbers would decide matters now. 3 days later, shortly after breaking his fast, Tyrion found himself standing on the battlements of King's Landing, dressed in armor that did not match, plates borrowed and straps adjusted by his new squire, the soft-spoken Podrick Payne, or Pod as he had taken to calling the lad. The axe in his hands felt too heavy, its haft slick with nervous sweat despite the cool morning air. He clutched it, knuckles white, wondering if he would remember how to use the damned thing when a man twice his size came screaming at him with murder in his eyes. Behind him, Joffrey chattered excitedly, the boy king swaddled in gilded armor and self-importance. Tyrion had pleaded that Joffrey should remain in the Red Keep, both for the realm's sake and because the boy knew nothing of tactics and they could not afford the men listening to his commands. But Joffrey had insisted on being seen leading his men. He was almost 15, king by the gods' whim, and utterly ignorant of the battle about to be unfolding beneath his feet. Surrounding his nephew was an impressive array of armored men. There was the Kingsguard, Lord Commander Aris O'Kurt, Sir Mandan Moore, Sir Meryn Trant, Sir Balon Swan, Sir Philip Foote, Sir Harwin Plum, and Sandor Clegane. Around them swarmed the Queen Regent's chosen me, gold cloaks with red cloth tied around their pauldrons, led by Sir Osmond Kettle Black, and Sir Lancel Lannister, newly knighted after spending years as King Robert's squire. Tyrion's own protectors formed a looser ring. Bronn relaxed as if they were attending a mummers show rather than a battle. There were the Lannister men who had accompanied him to the capital when he had been made acting hand. Then there was scattering of sellswords and hedge knights, like Sir Lothar Brune, who had taken the coin and the risk of guarding him throughout his time in the city. The first hours of the battle had shown Tyrion both the limits of his military experience and the usefulness of clever, if unorthodox, tactics. He had calculated, wrongly, that Stannis would assault the Mudgate in force. All the reports placed the Baratheon host in the Kingswood, and the scouts on the Gold Road Bridge had returned for weeks insisting they had seen no sign of soldiers there. But while a few thousand men did indeed pour over the bridge by the Mudgate, the main host of Stannis Baratheon had emerged from the west instead, his army rolling across the fields in a long, bristling line between the King's Gate and Lion's Gate. Tyrion had cursed aloud, then set about shifting the bulk of the city's defenders with surprising speed, barking orders, pointing with his axe, forcing the archers and spearmen to abandon their old positions and form entirely new lines. The Mudgate he left under the command of Sandor Clegane and Sir Harwin Plum, ordering them to hold it at all costs. Only 33 ships of the royal fleet had remained loyal to them at the start of this war. Tyrion had half of those ships anchored in the Blackwater Rush, with the rest having been sent to Duskendale to preserve at least a token naval force for their use. The sailors of the ships still anchored out on the Rush, over 500 of them, had been given leather armor and a spear, and sent to stand near each of the gates, to defend them should they be breached. Tyrion had prayed that the entirety of Stannis' fleet would enter into the Rush, and he could destroy it all in one go, but it appeared the gods were not on his side in that regard. Even so, the wildfire had done its work. The green explosion had been magnificent and terrible, and the chain had risen at just the right moment, trapping nearly 100 ships behind the fiery curtain. But then something impossible happened. At first, Tyrion thought it was a trick of the wind. The wildfire burned fiercely, but then it shifted, as if pulled by an unseen hand. It crept along the water's surface in a slow, deliberate motion. Then it slithered up the muddy banks toward King's Landing itself. And then it was on the walls. Even in daylight the unnatural green glow washed over the battlements. The heat shimmered upward in waves. A few reckless men leaned over the crenels to stare down at the glowing mass. Their screams were cut short as their faces cooked in an instant, their lungs collapsing under the sudden blast of hungry fire. Their corpses toppled over the wall and vanished into the emerald blaze. Shouts rose from the Mudgate. Sandor Clegane pushed through the gold cloaks surrounding him, scattering them like children. Sir Harwin shouted after him, but the hound did not slow. He threw down his helm, his eyes wide and white with terror as he stormed away from the wildfire's advance. A coward and an oath-breaker, Sir Aris O'Kurt spat, hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. Tyrion said nothing. He doubted any man alive would have much luck forcing Sandor Clegane back to a place where green fire climbed the walls like a living thing. And if Aris wished to fight Sander over honor, Tyrion would put his coin on the hound, cowardice or no. Then the ladders came. Stannis' men clattered up them in waves, shouting, grim-faced, armored in Baratheon stags and the various sigils of the Stormlands and Reach. The first few surged over the parapets near the King's Gate, meeting swords and spears in a flurry of steel. The Rounds came forward as well, protected by shieldmen who marched under a hail of arrows, stones, boiling oil, and the curses of terrified defenders. Sir Balon Swan and Sir Philip Foot both volunteered to lead the sorties against the Rounds. Swan descended toward the Lion's Gate with methodical calm, Sir Philip marched down to ground before the King's Gate. Tyrion was too short to look over the walls to the ground below, especially with the fighting that took place around him. He could see a group of cavalry, led by Stannis himself, charge at the gate. The only men still left with bow in hand were inside the gatehouse itself. He could see the men who controlled the nearest scorpion swivel the device and fire a bolt, but the lack of cheers let him know Stannis still lived. Foot is dead, Bronn drawled, leaning over the wall with the lazy curiosity of someone watching a tavern brawl. Didn't put up much of a fight. That, Tyrion thought grimly, was the least surprising thing that had happened today. Baratheon soldiers were appearing atop the wall again, but the King's Guard and the Hand's Guards formed a steel circle around King and Uncle alike, cutting the attackers down as quickly as they appeared. Tyrion tightened his grip on his axe and forced himself not to think of how quickly that circle might break if panic set in. Shouts rose along the battlements, the wildfire was receding from the walls at last, rolling back down the muddy bank and letting the current drag it toward the bay again. A heartbeat later came a deep, shuddering crash. One of the great chain towers at the river's mouth had given way, its stones tumbling into the black water with a roar that echoed up the streets. Whatever ships had survived the inferno would try to flee now, slipping out past the broken tower before the flames found them. It was not the devastation Tyrion had hoped for, but he would take 16 empty hulks over 100 enemy crewed warships any day. More Baratheon men spilled over the walls. One pushed through their line of guards and charged straight at Joffrey. Tyrion did not think, he simply moved. The axe in his hands came down in a desperate, clumsy swing. He felt the blade bite through leather, felt the shudder as it lodged deep in the man's chest. The soldier crumpled at his feet, dragging the weapon with him, and Tyrion stared down at his empty hands, then at his nephew. Joffrey's face had gone white as bone. For one awful instant Tyrion thought the boy might faint. But the next threat was not aimed at the king. Armored Baratheon knights pushed past the fighting on the parapet and forced their way into the King's Gate's gatehouse. Tyrion knew what that meant even before the screams rose from inside. The defenders would be butchered, and the portcullis hauled up to let the Rounds batter the doors directly. Sir Jacelyn Bywater saw it as well. The commander was already bellowing for gold cloaks to retake the tower, though men were still scrambling to fend off the soldiers scaling the walls all around them. Tyrion grabbed at his axe and with a few desperate yanks, pulled it from the man's chest with a sickening squelch. And that was when Osney Kettleblack appeared, panting, helm under one arm, sweat streaking his face. The man had been one of the dozens who stayed back in the Red Keep, to defend it should the worst happen here. The youngest Kettleblack brother shoved past a pair of gold cloaks and bowed low to Joffrey. Behind him was Sir Balon Swan, after having led several successful sorties at the Lion's Gate. "My king, my lord," Hand Osney said between breaths, "Her Grace commands that His Majesty return to the Red Keep at once." Tyrion turned to look at Joffrey. The boy was trembling, though he did his best to hide it by gripping the parapet as if daring the enemy to come closer. His face was pale beneath his crown. "We are holding here," Tyrion said sharply. "If the king abandons the walls now, the men will break. They must see him. They must believe he stands with them." Osney swallowed. "Her Grace insists, my lord. She said the king will return. With or without your leave." Joffrey flinched as another man was cut down by their guards. There must have been 100 bodies littering the wall around them, so many it was getting difficult to step without tripping over them all. And unfortunately, not all of them were Stormlanders or Reachmen. "If the Queen Regent thinks it best," Joffrey said quickly, face pale. "The city must be defended, but the king must live to lead the realm." His voice cracked on the last word. Sir Meryn Trant hovered close behind him like a shiny mother hen. Tyrion stepped in front of Joffrey. Remember, your grace, you were the one who wanted to be on these walls, to lead your men. If you leave now, the city will fall. Your men will see you retreat and they will drop their weapons and run. You cannot ask them to die for a king who will not stand with them. For a heartbeat, he thought the boy might listen. But fear had already devoured whatever shred of courage Joffrey possessed. I am your king and I command it, Joffrey snapped. Sir Balon, escort me. Sir Meryn, you too. And you, Kettle Blacks. Sir Balon Swan gave Tyrion a helpless look. Sir Meryn did not bother with apologies. Osmond only grinned faintly, enjoying the hand's helplessness far too much. From behind him, Bronn muttered, "Here we go." And then the king was gone, hurrying down the steps with his guards forming a desperate wedge around him. The loss of 2 of the king's guard, who were already in short supply after Clegane fled and Sir Philip was killed, was almost as morale-draining as Joffrey leaving with his near 30 guards. The gold cloaks saw the king fleeing, and panic spread like rot. Some of them threw down their spears at once. Others backed away from the parapets, muttering that the king did not think they were going to win, and was fleeing the city. A few simply leapt down stairwells 2 or 3 steps at a time and vanished into the maze of the city below. Dozens abandoned their posts. "Cowards," shouted one of the captains. Bronn said cheerfully. "But they are live cowards." Tyrion's jaw clenched. With Joffrey gone, with more and more men appearing over the walls, with rams pounding at the gates, he could feel the entire defense beginning to unravel. He turned to Sir Jacelyn Bywater, commander of the city watch. "You hold the walls," Tyrion said. "Every man you have. No excuses. You let none who climb those ladders live, and you will take back that gatehouse." Bywater nodded grimly. "I will hold as long as I can, my lord. That is all any of us can promise." Tyrion's mind was racing now, faster than the shouts rising from the streets below. How many of the near 200 sailors still waited on the ground for the gates to break open before them? Did they flee when they saw Joffrey run away from the fighting? If the gate was battered open, and everything indicated it would happen, then skill and bravery alone would not stop Stannis Baratheon. He turned to the men still left to him, Bronn, Sir Mandon Moore, Sir Aris O'Kurt, the Lannister men and his paid swords. It was not enough. He gathered some of the gold cloaks as well, pulling them from areas of the wall where they grouped in bunches, like prey gathering for safety in numbers. "With me," Tyrion barked. "We fall back and prepare the streets outside the King's Gate. Barricades at every crossing. Ambushes in every doorway. Stannis Baratheon will give us no quarter, and we shall return the favor." Some looked uncertain. 1 or 2 stared longingly toward the staircases Joffrey had taken. Tyrion saw their hesitation and felt fury burn hot in his chest. "You bloody fools," he shouted. "I am half a man, and look, I am still here. Will you let a dwarf show you what courage looks like? Will you let people say that a dwarf was twice as brave as you, a full man? That did it." Shame moved where loyalty had failed. Spears were lifted. Swords unsheathed. Even the most uncertain among them straightened their backs. "Good," Tyrion said. "Now let's make them choke on every street of this city." They descended the battlements just as a fresh boom shook the gatehouse. Dust rained from above. A stone tile cracked under the blow. They did not have long. At the base of the stairs, Lothar Brune stepped away from them, his armor splashed with someone else's blood. "My lord," Lothar said, "the King's Gate will not hold much longer. I will rally the men and I will hold the breach for as long as the gods allow. You will have your time to prepare." Tyrion studied him. Lothar was no knight of great renown. He was a squat man, more of height with Tyrion than the other knights who stood around them. Of distant noble birth, he had taken to selling his sword to make ends meet. Just a hard, capable man who knew how battles ended, and that some were lost so others could be won. "You will die," Tyrion said quietly. Lothar shrugged. "Most likely. I came for coin, my lord. I will have to die for something." Bronn snorted. "He's not wrong." Tyrion wanted to forbid it. He wanted to order Lothar to retreat with him, to preserve what few capable men he had left. But if the gatehouse fell too quickly, Stannis' army would spill into the city before the defenses were ready. And then all would be lost. "Very well," Tyrion said, voice rough. "Lift the men's spirit and buy us as much time as you can." Lothar nodded once, sharply. "7 save you, my lord." "And you," Tyrion replied. "Though I doubt they are paying much attention today." Brune grinned, pulled down his visor, and strode off toward the doomed gatehouse. Most, if not all, of the sailors still stood just past the reach of the gates should they be thrown open. They stood with spears gripped in their hands, scattered with no thought to formations or positioning. Sir Lothar was quick to start snapping orders, organizing them as best he could. Tyrion watched him go for a moment, giving a sad shake of his head. Then he turned to the others. "Let's go," Tyrion said. "We have a city to save." And with Bronn, Sir Mandon, Sir Aris, and 200 frightened men at his back, he began to shape the streets of King's Landing into a killing ground. Chapter 52, Bran 7. /n. This story is quickly approaching the end. At least I think it is. I originally had planned out roughly 50 chapters, but I kept changing plot points as I wrote, and now it's looking like it will be between 61 to 63 chapters. The sequel is tentatively called The Wars of Autumn. I have about half of that story mapped out already, but I'm sure a lot of it will change as I go along. Bran 7. The Twins was an unimpressive fortress, at least to someone who had already seen so many of the great castles of Westeros. 2 squat stone keeps crouched on opposite banks of the Green Fork, joined by a stone bridge that arced over the water. The design was clever enough, it was certainly defensible, but it lacked presence. There was none of Storm's End's raw menace, no sunlit splendor like Highgarden or awe-inspiring majesty of the Eyrie, and no ancient dignity such as Winterfell's. The Twins did not inspire awe, it merely demanded coin. They passed the night within its walls. Lord Stephen Free hosted a feast in their honor, celebrating the departure of his sisters northward to begin their new lives as northern wives. Bran quickly realized the feast served another purpose as well. One by one, every eligible free girl still residing at the Twins was paraded before him, girls barely old enough to walk, shy maidens blushing behind their sleeves, and widows who smelled heavy with perfume, some a decade older than his own mother. Bran endured it all with stiff politeness, as he was taught to. He was old enough to understand that this was Lord Stephen's heavy-handed attempt at beginning the betrothal process. Any decision would belong to Bran's father, but Lord Stephen likely thought that if Bran found himself amiable to any of the free girls, that would sway Lord Stark's decision. That knowledge did little to ease his discomfort. Thankfully, Brian remained close at his side, an immovable presence that discouraged lingering hands and eager smiles alike. That included Lord Free himself, who spoke at length about the fertility of free women, a subject Bran did not understand and did not wish to. The neck was as he remembered from his time passing through it over a year ago, with Sir Robar in the king's company, heavy, damp, and alive in unsettling ways. The air smelled of stagnant water and rot, and unseen things slithered and splashed just beyond sight. The swamps whispered constantly, reeds rustling and insects humming in endless chorus. Sleep came poorly. Dry ground was scarce, and more often than not they slept atop the only elevated and dry land available, King's Road stone, where some uneven slab always found its way digging into Bran's back. Accompanying their party were 2 heavy wagons, one assigned to each former Lady Free, their axles creaking beneath the weight of dowries meant to advertise free generosity, bolts of cloth, chests of silver, furniture, and all the small, careful treasures a woman carried from one life into the next. It was within these wagons that Roslyn and Tyter made their journey north, spared the long miles in a saddle, riding instead among cushions and piled cloaks. With them traveled Sir Benfrey's wife and his 2 small children, huddled together beneath furs, bound for Carstark, where they would take up permanent residence. After a night of travel through mud and mist, Moat Cailin rose before them, a welcome sight to set eyes on. Where the wall had been half finished when he had headed south, it now stood complete, 12 feet of solid stone stretching between the 4 towers and a stout gatehouse. The causeway leading to it narrowed sharply, marsh pressing in on either side. Bran could easily see why Moat Cailin, broken as it once was, had remained legendary for its ability to hold the north against any southern host. 3 figures stood before the open gates. All were short of stature. The eldest was a small man with lines etched around his eyes and mouth, near in age to Bran's father, though scarcely a head taller than Bran himself. With him were 2 youths, though the ages were hard to tell due to their size, a girl perhaps Rob and John's age, quick-eyed and alert, and a pale boy only a few years older than Bran, thin and solemn in a way that made Bran uneasy. They all shared light brown hair and moss-green eyes, the sort that reminded Bran of shaded glades in the Wolf's Wood. The man and girl were both armed, clutching three-pronged spears in their hands, with rounded leather shields on their backs and what looked like fishing nets at their hips. They wore brown leather jerkins and weathered green cloaks pinned with copper brooches shaped like lizard lions. Bran frowned. He knew that sigil. It was a northern house, but he could not recall which one it belonged to. He tried to recall his lessons with Maester Lewin, but they felt so long ago. He was more than halfway to 11, and had been a page for Sir Robar for nearly 2 years. And in those 2 years, Sir Robar had been more focused on the southern half of the realm. Shouting echoed from beyond the wall, and with it the ring of steel. "Greetings, Brandon Stark," the small man called as they approached. Brian immediately guided her horse forward, placing herself between Bran and the strangers, her hand settling on her sword's hilt. Bran glanced down at Summer. His direwolf was tense, ears pricked and muscles coiled, but Bran could sense it was not toward the three before them. Summer's attention was fixed on the sounds beyond the wall. "Who are you, my lord?" Brian demanded. "Lord Howland Reed of House Reed," the man replied calmly. "And these are my children, Moira and Hojan." "What's with the screams?" Roderick Forrester asked, gesturing toward the wall. "The Ironborn attack Moat Cailin," Lord Reed said, his expression darkening. "Ironborn," Roderick muttered, spitting onto the road as if the word itself were foul. "They came some Senites past," Reed continued. "They did not know the keep had been rebuilt and lacked the numbers to take it in their initial attack. Now they have returned with several thousand men. We have brought what forces we could to aid in the defense. We must lend them our swords," Torren Karstark said, drawing his sword in a single smooth motion. Roderick Forrester agreed, pulling his axe from its place on his hip. Brian hesitated, biting her lip, a sign of indecision Bran had seen often in Arya. Though Roderick was older and both men more experienced in battle, Brian had become the unquestioned leader of the trio of Wolfsguard. "Go, Brian," Bran said. "My lord father counts Lord Reed as his most trusted friend. I will be safe with him. I will protect any child of Ned as fiercely as I would my own," Lord Reed said, voice somber. Brian looked the Cranogman over, clearly unimpressed by his stature. And then two locked eyes, and she must have seen something she liked, for she slowly nodded her head. "Then we shall aid in the defense," Brian said, unsheathing her own sword. Sir Benfrey followed suit at once, his hand tightening around the hilt of his own blade. "Guard my family," the Free Knight commanded, turning to the two men, one Karstark and the other Marndaly, who had been charged by their lords with shepherding the brides safely north. "See them to their homes. All of them." The three Wolfsguard and Sir Benfrey wheeled their horses and rode through the gates without another word. Bran heard a low rumble next to him and glanced down at his direwolf. Summer surged forward after them, paws striking the packed earth in a blur of motion. Bran watched as the direwolf slowed just long enough to lift his head and loose a long howl before bounding ahead once more. "I regret that your first true glimpse of the north is delayed by bloodshed," Lord Reed said, turning to the wagons where the free women sat stiff-backed and wide-eyed. "It is a hard land, but a beautiful one. You will see that, in time." Whatever reply the ladies of House Free might have offered, Bran never heard it. One heartbeat he was seated in the saddle beside them, reins clutched tight in his hands, and the next the world lurched and stretched, and he was running. But not running as he knew. It felt all wrong. The ground rushed beneath him in a way that made no sense. He felt the pull of muscle and sinew in four powerful limbs, the bite of cold air in a broad chest, the world suddenly rich with scent and sound. He moved low and fast, body stretched and flowing, as natural as breath. Summer. The realization struck like a hammer, and with it came a jolt of confusion so sharp that the direwolf nearly stumbled. Summer snarled in irritation, which Bran could feel like he could his own emotions, and the direwolf adjusted his stride, regaining his balance with effortless grace. Ahead loomed the palisade wall and the battered gates of Moat Cailin, growing closer with every bound. Dozens of bodies littered the ground before the palisade. Some lay twisted and still with crossbow bolts jutting from throats and chests, others sprawled face down in the mud with deep, savage cuts carved into their armor and flesh. A few reeked of salt and tar, the men of the sea, but most smelled of swamp water, pine, and damp earth, men of the north fallen on their own ground. Arrayed along the platform by the wall were close to 200 men, most with bows in hand, raining arrows down upon the Ironborn on the other side of the wall. Others stood ready with long spears, leaning out to jab and hook at any raider who managed to claw his way high enough to crest the wall, stabbing them back into the chaos beneath. Many of the defenders were small and lean, and Bran could only assume they were Cranogmen. At the gates themselves, already splintered and sagging inward, a ragged semicircle of lightly armored men stood clutching spears with white-knuckled hands. Fear poured off them in waves, sharp and sour, and to Bran's borrowed senses they smelled scarcely older than boys, of age with Robb and Jon, but lacking the experience in wielding weapons and fighting wars. "Clear the gates!" Brian bellowed, her sword flashing as she rode. "Clear the gates!" The spearmen scattered in a panic, scrambling aside just as the weakened timbers gave way. With a shriek of tearing wood, the gates burst inward and the Ironborn poured through the breach in a howling tide of flesh, leather, and iron. They barely had time to raise their axes before several thousand pounds of horseflesh and armored riders smashed into them. Despite it being only 4 horses, the impact was devastating. Men flew, crushed beneath hooves or hurled aside like broken dolls as the Wolfsguard and Sir Benfrey drove straight through the choke point, blades rising and falling in brutal arcs. Steel rang on steel, horses whinnied, and the copper-tanged scent of blood blanketed the air. Summer was among the Ironborn an instant later. Bran felt the snap of powerful jaws as teeth tore through soaked leather and into yielding flesh. A scream cut short as Summer shook his head, ripping free in a spray of blood and cloth before lunging again. "Don't just stand there," a voice roared above the chaos. Bran tore his gaze, Summer's gaze, away from the man he was savaging to glimpse stewardly Obald Tallheart. The man was clad in chainmail, a great sword gripped in both hands, his face red with fury as he shouted at the shaken spearmen who had fallen back from the gate. "Get your asses in there!" And without waiting to see if they obeyed, Tallheart charged headlong into the press, swinging his great sword in a wide, murderous arc as he plunged into the writhing mass of bodies at the shattered gates of Moat Cailin. The fighting dissolved into a smear of screams, blood, heat, and motion blending together until Bran could no longer tell where one moment ended and the next began. He could not have counted the men whose throats Summer had torn out, nor the limbs wrenched free with bone-snapping force. Or had those been his teeth doing the ripping? It had been hard to tell where Bran ended and Summer began. The sensations, the feelings, they all felt so real, as if Bran was truly experiencing it. In the end, the direwolf remained the one truly in command, driven by instinct older and sharper than any human thought, and that is what allowed Bran's mind to recognize the distinction between the two of them. Brandon. The world lurched. Bran blinked and found himself back in his own body, the familiar weight of it settling around him. He sat atop his horse once more, fingers stiff on the reins, his heart pounding, and sweat at his brow as though he had been running. He turned his head sharply toward the voice and met Lord Reed's gaze, the Cranogman watching him with quiet intensity. The others were staring as well, concern written plainly across their faces. All but Hojan. The Reed boy's green eyes were fixed on Bran with a solemn, unsettling calm, as though he had witnessed something long expected. "Sorry," Bran said quickly, heat flooding his cheeks. The words felt thin, inadequate. "I was concerned for the battle." Lord Reed studied him for a long moment, eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing truths better left unspoken. At last, he inclined his head in a slow nod. "I was asking about your brother Jon," he said mildly. "Is he not also bound for the north? I would have thought he would be traveling with you." Bran frowned. While Jon traveling to Castle Black was not protected knowledge, it had not been known outside of a handful of people. Had one of them mentioned it in a letter to Lord Reed? Or perhaps one of the Wolfsguard mentioned it in passing to the Free Ladies during their travels, who in turn passed it on to Lord Reed while Bran had been otherwise occupied. "He's taking a ship," he answered. "Sailing north to Eastwatch and then on to Castle Black." Lord Reed gave a small, disappointed look as he nodded his head. Bran could only wonder what that was about, as he turned his attention back to the gates and the fighting taking place at the other end of the growing town. When the sun began to set, the Ironborn were finally driven back from Moat Cailin. The fighting did not end in celebration, but in weariness. Of the 750 men who had held the walls, 400 of them Crannog men, 100 were dead. 3 times that number were wounded, many badly. Bran heard men saying that another 100 might yet die before their wounds healed. Steward Leopold Tallheart survived the battle, but his injuries were severe. One arm had been crushed by an iron-borne hammer and hung useless at his side. The healers spoke quietly of the likelihood that it would need to be amputated. Sir Benfrey had taken a dagger to the chest during the fighting at the gate. By chance or the god's mercy, the blade had missed his heart. Roslin said as much herself, though her face was pale as she stayed near her brother. The 3 members of the Wolf's Guard had all proved themselves in the battle. Cuts that were cleaned out with boiling wine and sewed in uneven stitches by each other's hands, bruises that caused a wince every time they moved, and a mutter prayer to whichever gods were listening that they be granted a small reprieve from fighting, at least until they reached Winterfell. Despite this, their wounds had been relatively minor, and they had killed at least a score of men between them. The Ironborn losses were far greater. Over 300 lay dead before the northern palisades, their bodies scattered where they had tried to climb over the wall or force the gates from the north. Many of their wounded had been dragged away during the retreat, but the number left behind suggested they had suffered twice as many injured as well. Those injured turned prisoners who were still conscious were questioned under the direction of Brandon Tallheart, Leopold's eldest son, a youth of 17 who had blooded his sword in his first battle. From these prisoners, the purpose of the attack became clear. In Balon Greyjoy's eyes, the realm was divided and vulnerable. Kings had risen against one another, banners were crossed across the 7 kingdoms, and no one power held the realm together. Balon had declared himself king once more and proclaimed a return to the old way, reaving, raiding, and taking by force. Rather than strike south at richer lands, he had sent his reavers against the north. Balon had declared it was to capture their most needed resource, would to continue to build their fleet, but the men whispered it was because Ned Stark had defeated him in his rebellion, humbled him before the realm, and taken his last living son as a ward. Their aim had been clear enough: seize Moat Cailin and seal the neck, trapping the northern host still fighting in the south and cutting it off from home. While that chokehold held, the Ironborn would fan out along the western coast. They would capture Barrowton, Deepwood Motte, Bear Island, Sea Dragon Point, and the Stony Shore, and then fortify their gains to hold against any retaliation. The first attack against Moat Cailin had been by 500 men, sent against what the Ironborn believed were 3 broken towers, but the rebuilt keep and its northern palisades had thrown them back, even in a night assault. That failure had drawn Victorian Greyjoy himself from Torrens Square, where he had been preparing to lay siege. With him came 5,000 men, enough to drown Moat Cailin in blood if numbers alone decided such things. Yet even with that advantage, the Ironborn attack had stalled, then broken, until Outriders reported Greyjoy's banners retreating toward the ships anchored in the Fever. And why had Victorian Greyjoy called off the attack? The reason, Torrhen said, was Brienne of Tarth. She had challenged Victorian to single combat before the walls. While some men might initially balk at being challenged by a woman, the Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet had no such qualms. He had met the challenge with vigor. But despite his formidable skill, Brienne proved too much for him. She met every blow of his axe with her sword, drove him back step by step, until she had cut a nasty wound in his thigh, in the gap of the armor near the groin. When the Lord Captain had collapsed from the wound, several of his men had rushed forward and dragged him from the battle, despite his angry bellows to leave him to continue the fight. You should have seen her, Torrhen cried that night, eyes bright as he relived it. The Kraken fled because the Maid of Tarth broke him. And with their commander being pulled from the field, the rest of his men lost hope and retreated from the walls. The morning after the battle, Brian, Roderick, and Torrhen agreed that there was no reason to delay further, they would continue on to Winterfell at once. The road north was open and there was no telling how long it would last until the Ironborn returned. Every day lost was another day the north stood exposed. Roslyn Karstark would remain behind until her brother was fit enough to travel, with Tyter staying at her side, both for comfort and for safety. Bran found Lord Reed beyond the walls, directing the grim work that followed any battle. The Ironborn dead were being dragged from the field and stacked into rough pyres, their armor and other valuables stripped away and set aside. Men moved quietly among the bodies with torches, setting the piles alight one by one. The smell of smoke and charred flesh mixed with the damp scent of the neck, and Bran forced himself not to look away. "I have a letter for you, Lord Reed," Bran said, stepping closer. "From my brother Robb. I forgot it yesterday, during the fighting." He held out the parchment, sealed in grey wax. He had delivered a similar letter to Steward Tallheart that morning, who had been awake but feverish. The letter had been read aloud by his son Brandon, who sat at his father's side. Lord Reed accepted his letter with a slight bow of his head and broke the seal with a practiced flick of his thumb. As his eyes moved across the words, his expression changed to surprise. His brows rose higher with each line. When he finished, he looked at Bran over the edge of the parchment. "House Reed will serve House Stark as it always has," he said softly, then inclined his head once more. "My prince." Without ceremony, he crossed to the nearest pyre and tossed the letter into the flames. Bran watched as the wax melted and the parchment curled in on itself, the words turning to ash. Lord Reed waited until the fire had taken it fully before turning back. "I would ask a favor of you, if I may be so bold," he said. Bran straightened, recalling Maester Lewin's lessons and his mother's quiet corrections. "If it is a favor I can grant," he said carefully, "I will. I ask that you take my children with you to Winterfell as honored guests," Lord Reed said. "Let them be among the Starks, as your father and I once stood together. So the next generation of Reeds and Starks may know one another as friends, and trust each other as deeply as we do." Bran thought it over. It did not seem so hard a favor to grant. "Do they have their own horses?" "Aye. And they know how to hunt and scavenge. My children will not be a burden during your journey, I can promise you that." Bran was grateful for Meera and Hojan's company during the remaining 2 nights of the journey to Winterfell. The road north felt longer than he remembered. With Brian, Roderick, and Torrhen riding ahead, there was little to do but ride, watch the land change, and think, something Bran found he did far too much of when left alone. Meera made certain he was not left alone often. Whenever they stopped, she was quick to pull him from his horse and into the grass, showing him how Crannog men hunted and moved through the world. She taught him how to set small snares, how to read broken grass and bent twigs, and how to move quietly even when the ground was damp or uneven. The methods worked far better in the neck, she admitted, where water and reeds could hide a hunter's approach, but she insisted the skills were worth learning anywhere. She also showed him the weapons of her people. The 3-pronged frog spear felt awkward in Bran's hands at first, its balance unlike any sword or axe, and the net was worse, tangling around his arms more often than not. Meera only laughed and patiently showed him again, explaining that Crannog men were small in stature and could not rely on brute strength in a fight. They were quicker and had learned long ago that survival mattered more than great deeds. Speed, surprise, and clever tricks won fights, not shining armor or vows of honor. "Honor will not save you once you are bleeding in the mud," Meera said lightly one evening, as she demonstrated how to hook a frog spear behind an enemy's knee. "Better to be alive and called a coward than dead and praised." Hojan, by contrast, watched more than he spoke. He often lingered at the edge of the camp, staring into the fire or out across the fields as if he saw something no one else could. When he did speak, it was in a soft, measured voice that made Bran lean closer to catch his words. His sentences came out twisted, full of riddles and half-meanings, and more than once Bran was left unsure whether Hojan was answering a question or asking one of his own. Sometimes Bran caught Meera watching her brother with a guarded look that he could not interpret. It made Bran uneasy. There was something about Hojan that felt heavy, as though he carried knowledge meant for older men, or secrets that did not belong to children at all. As they rode farther north, the land slowly changed. The damp air of the neck gave way to cooler winds that smelled of grass and pine. The hills of the Barrowlands rose to their left while the white knife cut through the land to their right. Each mile made his chest tighten with anticipation. This was his home. No matter how far he had traveled or how much he had seen, nothing stirred him the way the north did. On the morning of the 14th day, Winterfell finally appeared on the horizon. Its grey stone walls rose from the land, solid and unyielding beneath the pale sky. Bran felt a rush of relief so strong it nearly stole his breath. The towers were exactly as he remembered them, and for the first time since arriving at Old Town, he felt truly safe. "Winterfell," Meera said, smiling as she followed his gaze. Bran sat a little straighter in the saddle as they rode toward the gates, his heart pounding. At last he was home. Chapter 53, John 13. John 13. The ship that arrived at Solpans to collect them flew the Merman of House Mandaeli. It was a broad-bellied trading vessel, normally used to haul cattle and sheep along the coast, the stink of livestock still clinging to the empty hold. The space meant Ghost could be kept below deck, with straw laid out and a corner fenced off, so John did not have to worry about Ghost using his cramped quarters as a privy and the awful smell that accompanied it. The crew went quiet the moment Ghost padded up the gangplank. The captain gave an uneasy laugh as he watched the direwolf step onto the deck. "That explains the goats," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Lord Mandaeli sent 2 slaughtered whole. Thought it a strange kindness. The voyage north took nearly 2 se'nights." John had sailed before, but never this long nor so far into open water. From Solpans they crossed the Bay of Crabs, skirted the Vale's cliffs, then struck out north across cold, rolling seas before sailing along the northeastern shore into the Bay of Seals. The wind bit harder each day. Spray froze on the rigging overnight. Small John did not take to the sea. The huge man spent most of the voyage gripping the rail, face pale, retching whenever the deck pitched too sharply. Daisy, who was equally capable on a ship as she was on land, lent a hand to the crew to pass the time. Eastwatch by the sea appeared out of the fog one grey morning. 6 ships with black sails bobbed in the harbour. There were floating docks that stretched into the sea and were tied to the shore with thick rope and chain. Wooden planks, that John suspected were replaced often, led from the docks to slick steps up a thick sea wall, reinforced against storms and crashing waves. As Lord Commander Mormont's niece, Daisy took the lead through Eastwatch's narrow yard and up toward the keep that overlooked the frozen harbour. The Black brothers they passed watched them with open curiosity and fear, though John was used to the fearful looks that followed Ghost. When Daisy explained their purpose, they were waved through without delay and directed toward the commander of Eastwatch. Small John remained in the yard, still feeling the effects of the voyage, Kennett, Gannon, and Ghost staying with him. Cotter Pike was waiting for them in a chamber that smelled of salt, smoke, and old leather. "The Lord Commander went north of the wall almost 3 se'nights ago," Pike said when they explained that they had traveled north to speak with the man. That was information they already knew, but they could not let the man know that because they could not tell the real reason John needed to go beyond the wall. That John's 10-year-old brother had visions that indicated the men of the Night's Watch who had ventured beyond the wall for this ranging were in trouble, and that only John could save them. Who would believe such a thing? "This is urgent. My brother, the acting Lord Stark, believes stopping Mance Rayder is essential, and we need to speak with the Lord Commander about strategy and logistics." Pike snorted softly. "Strategy's well and good, but logistics always come back to the same thing up here. We need more men." He scratched at his chin, considering. "Still, I can see why you'd want words with the old bear. I'll give you horses to Castle Black. You'll have to explain yourself again once there, but it's safer to travel west this side of the wall before heading north." Daisy leaned forward. "How much danger would we be in traveling west on the other side?" "If you stay close to the wall, not much," Pike said. "The wildlings don't linger near it. Not usually. Sides, haven't seen much of them with all the villages emptied out." John's brow furrowed. "Emptied out? Why?" "We don't know," Pike admitted. "They're a fiercely independent and combative bunch, but the wildlings that live in the villages near the wall have been there for centuries and we rarely have problems with them. To see them all gone is unsettling. That's part of why Mormont rode out. That, and to find out what's happened to our missing rangers." His gaze shifted to John. "Including your uncle?" John felt his stomach tighten. "What happened to Uncle Benjen?" "He hasn't returned from his ranging. Over a year gone now. They left Eastwatch not long after. The journey to Castle Black took 4 days." Thoughts of Uncle Benjen waited on John's thoughts. Each night they sheltered in the abandoned keeps of the Night's Watch. Pike had mentioned that Stone Door had been re-garrisoned with the influx of new recruits, but it lay farther west, past Castle Black and toward the Shadow Tower. Castle Black was as John remembered it, a collection of 6 stone towers and 6 square wooden buildings with only the wall to offer it protection. There were men in the yard when they entered, some of whom John recognized as Freys. He and Small John both received spiteful looks, making it clear the Freys recognized them as well. John only gave them a brief glance, but Smalljan eyed them right back, as if daring them to try something. Jon Snow called a familiar voice. Donal Noye, the one-armed blacksmith, strode toward them, thick-chested and soot-stained, a hammer hanging loose in his remaining hand. "What brings you back to Castle Black?" Noye asked. "Finally decided to take the black after all." Jon gave a soft chuckle, remembering his wish to do so in what felt like a lifetime ago. "No, I am here to speak with Lord Commander Mormont, but Cotter Pike told us he had gone beyond the wall with 300 brothers of the Night Watch." Noye tossed the hammer into the air and caught it again without looking. "That he did, lad. He felt we could spare so many because of the men your father and brother have been sending this way over the past year. War is bad for the land, but good for the Watch. If we want to go north, to speak with the Lord Commander, who do I speak with to pass through the gates?" "Bowen Marsh is in charge." Bowen Marsh met them in the Lord Commander's solar, sitting behind the desk meant for Jeor Mormont. He was Lord Steward of the Night's Watch, one of the leaders who helped the Lord Commander run the order, but did not have the look of a leader. "I don't understand why you cannot wait for the Lord Commander to come back." "And how long will that take?" Smalljan asked. "Another few Senites. A moon's turn." The man did not answer, and Jon doubted he had one to give. "We were sent to speak with my uncle and to send word to Lord Robb with speed," Dacey chimed in. "It's dangerous beyond the wall. I cannot just allow anyone through," Bowen argued, his round cheeks reddening further, reminding Jon of a pomegranate. "We would not be helpless to the wildlings." "We're 5 warriors and a direwolf," Smalljan argued back, "who is a better scout than any man, I swear on the old gods. The Watch does not answer to Winterfell or any of the northern houses." Jon agreed, "but it still exists because of the northern houses. You should know that as a brother, and a Northman." Dacey leaned forward in her chair, drawing Marsh's gaze. "Where did my uncle go? How far north did he plan to travel?" Bowen eyed them, weighing if they were trustworthy enough to tell, as if they might run from this meeting to personally tell the wildlings all they had heard. "As far north as the Giant's Stair, about a 5 to 6 days' journey from here. Though he'd likely set up camp at the Fist of the First Men." Jon recalled Bran's vision, of 300 crows sitting on a fist sticking out of the ground. This great ranging had likely been camped at the Fist of the First Men for 2 Senites already. It was possible whatever foul deed was to befall them had happened already. "Lord Steward, we come on the orders of the acting Lord Stark to work out how the North can assist the Night's Watch in its hour of need against the so-called King beyond the wall. One of your own former brothers, if what I am hearing is to be believed. I have strict instructions from my brother to speak with, and work out the beginnings of a plan, with the Lord Commander. I will not sit here and wait for the Lord Commander to return, for I cannot delay in this endeavor. If you will not allow us through the wall, then we will turn back, tell my brother the Watch is not interested in our assistance, and leave the Night's Watch to deal with the wildlings on their own." The Lord Steward's face turned redder and redder with each word Jon spoke, until it was so red he feared it might burst. Either they would be allowed beyond the wall or they would be thrown out of Castle Black. Either way Jon did not think they would be welcomed here much longer. Finally, Marsh spoke through clenched teeth. "You may pass beyond the wall. But know this decision is yours. The Night's Watch will bear no blame if 2 northern heirs die in the wilderness." It was not approval, but it was permission, and that was enough. They were given an escort, so they did not get lost in the wilderness before finding Lord Commander Mormont, but no horses. Ketter had been a ranger in the Night's Watch for almost a decade and had been on a few dozen rangings. While he was not much for words, he appeared to know the lands and where they needed to go. They were also provided food, water, wine, and 2 small casks of oil, all of which Jon paid the Night's Watch for. The oil got strange looks, but Bran had said in some of his dreams, the White Wolf breathed fire. If Jon was the White Wolf, as he and Robb suspected, he had not discovered any hidden fire-breathing talents and so figured he would have to make fire some other way. Ketter led them past abandoned villages, most no more than a handful of buildings. He skirted around a small grouping of buildings he said belonged to a man named Craster, and he spit on the ground when he uttered the name. Unlike the villages, the home of Craster did not appear abandoned, as Jon could see multiple women of different ages cutting firewood and tending to a few livestock. "The Watch has an agreement with Craster," Ketter spat again. He provides us shelter and food on rangings, and we give him supplies like cloth and wine, but I avoid him unless I have no choice. None of them pressed Keter about why he avoided Craster. On the third day they were being followed. John himself was not able to tell, but Ghost knew. The direwolf had slipped off early that morning and had yet to return. But even not knowing where his direwolf was, because Ghost knew of the followers, so did John. There were 8 of them, each of them with their own distinctive smell, but still smelling similar enough to the people of the north. And while these 8, wildlings no doubt, stalked John's party, they were in turn being stalked by Ghost. "I'll be back," he murmured to Smalljan. "Just keep following Keter." The man looked down at him in confusion, but John was already slipping into trees around them. Those following them were traveling parallel to them to the east, atop a ridgeline John could barely make out through the trees. He moved into the trees to the west for a few hundred feet before doubling back. Once he felt he had gone far enough, he crossed east, and walked along the bottom of the ridge until he found a steep but climbable slope. At the top he moved as quickly as he dared, doing his best to limit the crunching of the snow beneath his feet. He was unsure how much time had passed, though it could not have been much, before he could see Ghost slowly making his way through the brush. His direwolf looked back at him briefly before turning his attention back to the wildlings. John could see them too. The 8 of them were still together, covered in thick furs from head to toe, attention on Smalljan and the others down below. They were carrying spears and axes, 2 of them had bows and full quivers on their backs. And they were arguing quietly amongst themselves. "Mans said to scout," a female voice hissed. "To see if any more crows come. He never said to kill them." "There won't be no more crows coming if we kill them now," a rough voice responded. "Most of them ain't wearing black," another voice added, dubious. "Hold on, one of them is missing. There was 6, now there's 5. No one saw him leave. Maybe stopped to piss." The 2 with the bows would be the biggest threats. Before he could fully think it, Ghost was slipping off deeper into the woods. John knew the direwolf was going to flank the wildlings. He kept pace with the wildlings as they argued about where he had gone, and waited for Ghost to get in position. Once he could tell Ghost was on their right flank, John pulled his sword and approached the wildlings quickly from behind. "Throw down your weapons and you won't be harmed," he called out. Each of them jumped in shock, turning to look at him in fear, which quickly changed to amusement. "The boy thinks he can take us," the rough voice, belonging to the largest of the wildlings, said. He brought his axe with the stone head up to casually rest it on his shoulder. "Kill him." A man with a bow reached into his quiver and pulled out an arrow, but he never got to nock it. Ghost slammed into him, jaws clamping on the arm that held the arrow, and the man let out an ear-piercing scream. "Direwolf." The attention shifted to Ghost, only briefly for some of them, but it was enough for John. He surged within sword range of the second bowman, cutting the tip of his sword through the furs of their chest, slicing through flesh and bone. The soft gasp of the final breath of air leaving the lungs let him know he had just killed his first woman. The big man with the axe charged at him, swinging the weapon wildly. John sidestepped the attack and let the man's momentum carry him past. 2 others came at him, both with spears in their hands, so he moved to his right, putting one spearman in the way of the other. The one in front jabbed at him, but he deflected the spear point with his sword and surged into their reach, stealing the space they needed to fight. He slammed the hilt of his sword into their head and shoved them into the spearman behind them, who had been trying to move around their ally. The second spearman stumbled as their friend hit them, and it was enough for John to bury his sword in their chest. Both of them dropped. He turned just in time and barely managed to bring his sword up to meet the new attack. The impact of the wildling's axe rang through his arms and shoulders, driving him back a step, then another. The blow was stronger than John expected. The big man hacked again, overhand and reckless. John twisted aside, the axe head biting into the frozen earth where his chest had been a heartbeat before. He started forward, blade already moving toward the opening in the man's guard, and then instinct screamed at him to move. John leapt backward just as another axe whistled through the space he'd occupied. Another wildling came at him snarling, smaller but quicker, his weapon chopping in tight, brutal arcs meant to overwhelm. John pivoted, steel meeting stone, sparks flashing in the grey light as he parried and slid inside the man's reach. He drove his sword up beneath the wilderling's ribs, felt it punch through fur, leather, and flesh. The man sagged with a grunt, blood steaming as it spilled onto the snow. The continued screaming off to the side drew John's attention. Ghost had finished with the bowman. The man's arm hung at an impossible angle, shredded to bone, and Ghost's jaws closed on his throat with a sharp snap. The scream cut off instantly. The direwolf wrenched free, crimson staining his white fur, and turned on the remaining two wildlings without hesitation. They tried to hold him off with spears, stabbing and retreating, fear plain in their scent. Ghost darted in low, faster than either could track, his shoulder slamming into one man's hips. As the wilderling fell, Ghost was already on his throat, crushing his windpipe. The second spear thrust scraped along Ghost's flank, drawing red, but it earned its wielder a mouthful of teeth in return. Ghost lunged, jaws closing around the man's face, and shook until the body went limp. John turned back just as the larger axe-wielder charged again, bellowing in rage at the sight of his fallen companions. This time John met him head-on. He caught the axe on his blade, shoved hard, and as the wilderling overextended, John stepped in and drove his sword straight through the man's chest. The wilderling stared at him in disbelief, breath bubbling red at his lips before John wrenched the blade free and let the body fall. It was at that moment the others rushed up the ridge, weapons drawn and ready for a fight, only to stop short at the scene before them. They each stared in shock, their chest heaving from the quick climb, before Small John let out a bellowing laugh. "You might be the most dangerous man beyond the wall, smallest John." Ghost, muzzle stained with blood, padded up to the spearman John had hit in the head, and licked at their face. The person groaned and tried to shift away from the wet tongue. "We gotta live," one Kennett murmured. "Not for long," Ketter answered, pulling a dirk from his belt. He moved to the down figure, knife raised and ready to plunge downward. "Hold!" John shouted. "I subdued them, it is up to me what happens to them." John stepped between Ketter and the fallen wilderling, sword still slick with blood in his hand. Ketter stumbled back. "They'll kill us given the chance." "She's wounded," John said, crouching. Now that the fighting was done, he could see her clearly. Blonde hair spilled from beneath her fur hood, tangled and matted with blood from a cut the hilt of his sword had opened in her forehead. She could not have been much older than John himself. "And dangerous," Ketter replied. John ignored him. He pressed the flat of his blade against the wilderling's neck. "Drop the act. You're awake." Her eyes snapped open, bright blue and burning with fury. She spat at him, missing by inches. "Crow. I am no crow. Bind her." Gannon moved at once, hauling the wilderling upright despite her curses and struggles. She fought them savagely, teeth snapping, boots kicking, but between Small John and Gannon they were able to hold her in place. Daisy took her arms and held them together while Kennett looped rope around her wrists, cinching it tight. When they were done, the wilderling stood breathing hard, chin lifted in defiance. Even bruised and blooded, there was no mistaking her beauty. Her hair caught the pale northern light, and her glare promised murder. "My name is John. What is yours?" She hesitated just long enough to show it was a choice. "Val," she said at last, chin lifting as if daring him to remember it. "Val," John repeated, testing the sound of it. "You will be coming with us." He crouched and wiped his blade clean on the furs of one of the fallen wildlings. Val watched him closely as he did it, eyes sharp, unflinching. Most women south of the wall would have turned away at the sight of blood soaking into snow. Val did not. When his sword was clean enough, John cut a strip of cloth from an unstained portion of the dead man's furs. Kennett looped a length of rope around Val's wrist and tied the other end to Gannon's belt. As he worked, John pressed the cloth to the gash on her forehead. She flinched but did not cry out. When the rope was secured, John lifted her bound hands and forced the cloth into her grip. "Hold it there," he said. "Unless you want to bleed out." Her glare promised it would take more than blood loss to kill her. He ignored her and checked on Ghost. The cut down Ghost's side was not as long as he feared, but it was deeper than he would have liked. Ghost did not seem too concerned with the wound, so John would let it be for now. John rose and nodded once to Ketter. They moved out again. "We have to burn the bodies," Val protested. She dug in her heels until Gannon was far enough ahead that the rope snapped tight and dragged her after him. "We're short on fire," Daisy said without breaking stride. "So your friends will have to settle for being crow food." John glanced back. Val's scowl would have made most men cower, but Daisy met it with cool indifference. They kept walking. Val was forced to follow, stumbling and cursing, fighting every step Gannon took. "We have to burn them or they'll come back," Val shouted. Small John shook his head. "How hard did you hit her?" "Not hard enough," Daisy replied. That night, John questioned her. "What is Mance Rayder planning?" he asked, voice even. She laughed in his face, sharp and humorless. "You think I'd tell you anything? You crows will die blind." John crouched so they were eye to eye. "I am not a crow." "Why did he send you to scout our trail? Is he planning an attack?" "He wanted to see if you were worth killing." John let the silence stretch. The fire crackled softly between them. A small tin cup of Ketters, filled with wine, sat over the flames. Val met his stare without flinching, without fear. He got nothing more from her. By then the wine was boiling and John used it to clean the wound in Ghost's side, much to the direwolf's irritation. He'd feel better if he could stitch the wound closed, but none of them had a needle. The next day was worse. Val slowed them whenever she could, stumbling on clear ground, dragging her feet through the snow until Gannon was forced to haul her along by the rope. They stopped to rest when the sun stood high overhead. Salted beef was passed around along with a water skin. Val sat apart from them on the ground, wrists bound, eyes tracking every movement. John approached and offered her a strip of beef. She took it with some suspicion, tore off a chunk with her teeth, and chewed quickly, like someone used to eating before food was taken away. He waited while she finished, then handed her the water skin. She drank deeply before passing it back. John turned to leave. "You think Mance is your enemy?" she hissed at his back. "You're fools. He's the only one trying to save us." John stopped. "From what?" Her smile vanished as if it had never been there. "The dead," she said. "They walk. They don't feel steel. They don't fear pain. Fire is the only thing that stops them." A chill crept through John that had nothing to do with the wind. "A wilderling woman at Winterfell," Osha said the same. Val studied him, blue eyes searching his face for mockery or deceit. "What was a free folk doing south of the wall?" "She got around the wall with a raiding party," John said. "They tried to attack my brother's wife. The others were killed. Osha was taken prisoner. And now she has earned her freedom and works in Winterfell's kitchen. A servant." Val scoffed. "That does not sound like freedom to me." John shrugged in response. "She is free to leave if she wants, but she chooses to stay because she has shelter and food. Things she would not find on her own." "And do they believe her?" Val asked. "When she speaks of the dead." John rubbed at the back of his head, the memory sitting heavy. "We thought her mad." Val looked away, toward the darkening trees. "You won't think that for much longer." That night, as they made camp, Small John nudged John with an elbow, grinning. "Didn't take you long to find yourself a wilderling girl." "I am trying to get information out of her," John answered with a glare. "Not that you would notice, being too busy with Daisy." He looked back and forth between their shocked faces. "Did you think I would not notice?" He had not noticed, but Ghost had. The sounds of their sex, while too quiet for John to hear over the sounds of nature and crackling fires, was not too quiet for Ghost. And they each smelled of the other. Daisy muttered a curse. Small John laughed, booming and unapologetic. They were both adults, older than John by several years. As far as he knew, neither of them were betrothed either, so no one's honor was being besmirched. It was not on John to tell them what to do. "We're near the fist. Few miles away maybe," Ketter said, as he worked to get a fire going. The land rose subtly, trees thinning, the ground hard beneath their boots. There were footprints in the snow all around them. They were near the Night's Watch. Ghost could make out their smell, but there was something else. John could feel it himself, something heavy in the air, a pressure that made Ghost restless. The scream came just after nightfall. High. Long. Wrong. They were on their feet in an instant, weapons drawn. Another scream followed, then another, echoing across the dark hills. Wildlings, Kenneth said grimly. Val shook her head violently. No. What? Jon demanded. That's not us, she said, voice tight with fear. That's them. He knew what she meant, the dead. Jon approached her, drawing the knife at his side. She took a hesitant step back at his approach. He cut the rope that bound her wrist. What are you doing? Keter demanded, raising his sword and pointing it hesitantly at Jon and Val. She rubbed at her wrist and gave Jon a questioning look. Go, Jon urged. We are going to those screams, and if it is who you say, then you are better off not coming. Go. She did not need to be told again. She fled the way they came, disappearing into the trees, using the moonlight to guide her. She's going to circle back and kill us, Keter muttered. No, Jon said with a shake of his head. She will run until she cannot any longer. The others did not believe him, he could tell from the looks in their eyes. But as more and more screams filled the air, it became clear they had other things to worry about. We need to make torches. And get those casks of oil ready. I fear we will need as much fire as we can get tonight. Chapter 54, Tyrion 7 and Stannis 3. Tyrion 7. Tyrion had not just killed his first man today, he had also killed his second, third, fourth, plus who knew how many more. He had often heard Jaime talk about a sort of bloodlust that could overcome someone on the battlefield, where they would lose themselves in the fury of battle and forget all else around them. Tyrion experienced no such thing. Instead of a bloodlust, he found himself overcome with an overwhelming fear, a fear that any moment could be his last. As he ran, his short legs moving furiously to keep pace with the men around him, he struggled to pull back the string of the crossbow he had taken from one of his fallen guards. He had lost his axe in the fighting ages ago, and found he much preferred a crossbow, where his adversary could be attacked from a distance. It was a shame the bolts were a finite resource, as he only had one more left to him. They needed to set up another ambush spot, the fourth one so far. Or would it be the fifth? It was hard to keep track in all the fighting. The 70 men who had been with him in the first ambush had been whittled down to 23. Bronn was still by his side, and would likely continue to be so as long as Tyrion was alive to pay him gold. The Kingsguard had split off to lead the other groups and set up other ambushes, but the sounds of their fighting had been getting closer and closer every time he strained to hear it. They were all being pushed back to where the market roads that sat just inside the King's Gate crossed with the Street of Steel. It would likely be where they would make their last stand. When they came upon the Street of Steel, Tyrion found his group was not the first to arrive. Sir Mandon Moore was already there shouting at men to hide in alleys and to kick in doors to hide inside the shops and houses that lined the street. Tyrion began directing his men to do the same, urging them to move with speed, for who knew how much time they had until the Baratheon men were upon them. Sir Aris and his men soon joined them in the streets, but before the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard could direct his men to take position, Lancel appeared before them, having come from the most direct path to the Red Keep. His cousin was dirty and bloody when before he had been neither, and Tyrion knew that could only mean ill. The king is in danger. Lancel cried, desperate. Stagmen attacked us in the streets. We tried to fight, but they were too many and we were forced to run. Sir Balon sent me to get help. It was impossible for any of Stannis' men to have gotten around them so quickly and in large enough numbers to scatter a guard of 30. The ones who attacked Joffrey must have come from one of the other gates. The city was on the brink of falling. Tyrion stood in this small stretch of the Street of Steel with barely 70 men left, and now the king was in danger. Go, he instructed Sir Aris. Take your men and Sir Mandon and go save our king. I will hold here with Sir Mandon's men and my own. Sir Aris gave him a brief, pitying look. There would be no holding here. All they would be able to do before they were all killed was delay Stannis' men long enough for Joffrey to be rescued and brought back to the safety of the Red Keep. As much as Tyrion hated the lad, he was Jaime's son, and their king. Sir Mandon Moore shot Tyrion a withering look as he moved to join Sir Aris. The look was enough to make Tyrion's eyebrows raise as he watched the 2 Kingsguard and 26 men follow. Perhaps the knight did not approve of how Tyrion had led the battle for the city, or perhaps there was another reason for such a look. Whatever it was, he had no time to dwell on it. The sun was setting, Shadows were getting longer, and by nightfall he would likely be dead. Instead he hurried into a nearby shop, where he huddled with Bronn and a member of the Gold Cloaks, as they waited for the Baratheon men to appear. The shop sold ironmongery, hinges, nails, brackets, and other such dull necessities of city life. Tyrion crouched behind a heavy oak counter while Bronn pressed himself flat against the wall beside the door, peering through a crack in the shuttered window. The Gold Cloak, a broad-shouldered man whose name Tyrion had never learned, knelt on the other side of the counter with a short sword drawn and trembling slightly in his grip. Outside, the sounds of King's Landing dying reached them in fragments. Screaming, somewhere distant. The crash of something large falling. And beneath it all, drawing steadily closer, the heavy sound of many boots all striking the ground in unison. "How many?" Tyrion whispered. Bronn held up a hand without turning. A moment passed. Then he spread his fingers. Twice. 3 times. 100, give or take, Bronn murmured. Moving careful like. Not running, but not in any hurry either. They know where they're going. 100 men against his not quite 50. Even Tyrion's limited grasp of military tactics told him those numbers were not in his favor. And while his numbers could only dwindle, his enemies would likely continue to climb. Yet this was the street that had the most direct route to the September of Baelor. From the September it was a straight road to Shadowblack Path, and from there the Red Keep itself. If Stannis' men marched through here uncontested, Joffrey would have even less time than he already did. "Tell me," Tyrion breathed, more to himself than anyone else, "does my father pay the men outside to die for him, or just the men in here?" "The men in here," Bronn said pleasantly, "are paid by you." "And what exactly am I paying you to do?" "To not run." Bronn finally turned from the window, his dark eyes carrying that familiar expression of faint amusement that somehow never diminished regardless of how terrible the circumstances. "They'll pass within 10 feet of this door. If your lads in the other buildings hit them at the right moment, they'll bunch up like sheep. That's when we come out." Tyrion nodded slowly. It was a plan of the sort that sounded straightforward and was anything but. He thought of the last bolt in his crossbow and measured it against the column of men moving through the street outside. 1 bolt. The 50-odd men at his back. 100 men outside with spears and shields and the burning righteousness of a king who believed the gods had anointed him. He looked down at the crossbow in his hands and made a decision. He would save the bolt. The waiting was the worst of it. He had found that to be true in every ambush today. The body had no interest in patience, it wanted to run or fight or do anything other than crouch in a dusty shop surrounded by the smell of iron filings while the enemy marched past outside. He could hear them now without Bronn's help, the heavy tread of armored men, the creak of leather, the occasional murmured word between soldiers. They did not sound afraid. They sounded purposeful. Then the world erupted. The first volley of arrows came from the upper windows of a chandler's shop across the street, fewer than he would have liked, and Tyrion heard the sudden chaos of it through the walls. Shouts of alarm, the clatter of shields being raised, a scream that cut off very quickly. Before the Baratheon men could form a proper defensive line, the second volley came from further down the alley mouth, and then Tyrion's remaining men were pouring out of doorways and down from rooftops into the press of bodies below. "Now," Bronn said simply, and kicked the door open. Tyrion was through it before his better judgment could intervene. The street had become a roiling mass of struggling men. The Baratheon soldiers were armored better than Tyrion's own, but they were packed tightly and attacked from multiple sides, and for a moment the chaos was in the defenders' favor. Tyrion moved along the edge of the fighting, looking for his shot, the crossbow raised. He found it quickly, a sergeant type near the back of the column bellowing orders and pointing, trying to organize a counter-push. Tyrion put the bolt through his throat, and the man sat down very suddenly and said nothing more. Then the crossbow was empty, and Tyrion was standing in the middle of a battle with nothing but an empty crossbow and his own wits. He dropped below a sword stroke that would have shortened him by a head and scrambled sideways, letting the crossbow fall. He put a dead man's body between himself and the soldier who had swung at him. The soldier was already pivoting to finish the job when one of the Gold Cloaks tackled him from the side and they went down together in a grappling heap. Tyrion looked around desperately. There 3 feet away, a fallen Baratheon man at arms lay face down with a short-hafted military axe still tucked through his belt. Tyrion was on his knees beside the body before he had consciously decided to move, and the axe came free with a single hard pull. It was heavier than the one he had lost earlier, which had been adjusted to better fit him, and the new grip sat awkwardly in his shorter arm. He took a two-handed hold of it and found it manageable. He came back to his feet. What he lacked in reach and height, Tyrion had long understood, he would have to compensate for with angles. He waded back into the press. For a time, he could not have said how long, he fought with a ferocity he did not know he possessed. The axe swung low and heavy. Once he buried it into someone's knee and felt the man collapse. Once he drove the butt of the handle hard into another man's gut and left him folded over in the mud. The fear was still there, bright and insistent at the back of his mind, but it had been compressed into something small and hard that he could move around. He swung. He stepped. He swung again. Bronn was a fluid shadow at the edge of his vision, and Tyrion caught glimpses of him weaving through the fighting with the easy efficiency of a man who had done this too many times to find it remarkable. But the numbers were what they were, and it seemed more and more Baratheon men were joining the fray. For every enemy that fell, two seemed to fill his place, and Tyrion's own men were dying fast around him. The Baratheon soldiers had recovered from the initial shock and were pushing back hard, shields locked, spears leveled. The ambush had gutted out and become simply a brawl, and in a brawl, numbers always had the advantage. Tyrion took a knee to the face from a man he had not seen coming and staggered back against the wall of the ironmonger's shop. His vision swam. He shook his head, tried to blink it clear, and saw a Baratheon soldier turning toward him with a mace raised above his shoulder, a large man in a half-helm, his face split by something like satisfaction at finding such a small and easy target. Tyrion swung the axe upward and felt it connect with something, though whether it was the man's arm or the mace itself he could not tell. What he could tell was that the blow had not stopped the downswing. The mace came down in a glancing arc, deflected enough to miss his skull but catching him hard across the left temple and the side of his jaw. The street tilted. The noise of the fighting stretched and slowed, as if heard from the bottom of a deep well. He was on his hands and knees and did not know how he'd gotten there. The cobblestones were wet with blood that he hoped was not his. He tried to rise and found his arms had no opinion on the matter. The sounds of battle continued around him, very close and yet impossibly far away, and then the cobblestones rose up to meet him, and the sounds went away entirely. His last thought, absurdly, was that if they survived this, he would owe Bronn a lot of money. Stannis 3. The King's Gate had fallen. Stannis watched from the high ground above the southern approach as more and more of his men poured through the broken doors and into the city beyond. It was not just the upper gatehouse taken by his men, or the heavy wooden doors that had been broken in, it was the surrounding defenders on the wall who had either been cut down or fled into the city, tossing their weapons to the ground in their terror. He had seen gates fall before. They never looked like victory. They looked like the first stair of a very long climb. He turned his gaze south, toward the mud gate. The catapults had done their work well enough. The upper stonework of the gatehouse had been reduced to rubble, and the gate itself listed inward on broken hinges, but it had not yet given way entirely. His men continued to climb the ladders of the nearby walls, careful to give the gatehouse enough space to not be crushed by friendly stone, and he could see from here the bodies of his soldiers scattered in the churned mud like discarded things. The boiling oil had stopped coming, at least. Either the defenders had exhausted their supply or those who had poured it were dead. One way or another, it would not be long. Farther north, the breach near the Lion's Gate was visible even from this distance, a jagged tear in the stone face of the wall, not yet wide enough to march an army through but wider than it had been an hour before. His siege engines continued their methodical work, each stone striking the same wound, deepening it. The men assigned to that section would wait until the gap was sufficient. He had given the order himself, no men were to rush a half-breach and die for the privilege. They would wait. 3 gates, 3 assaults, and the city bleeding from all of them at once. He had planned for this. He had prepared for this, in a way that Renly never would have, in a way that Robert never had bothered to. His brother had taken the city once before, but Robert had not truly taken it so much as inherited the ruin that Tywin Lannister left him. Stannis had no such benefactors. What he had was discipline, and numbers, and the cold patience of a man who had understood since the siege of Storm's End that there were no short paths worth walking. Your Grace. Sir Justin Massey reined in beside him, his armor dented at the shoulder from some earlier encounter. Word from Lord Caron. Our men have taken the walls on either side of the King's Gate and are pushing toward the Mudgate and the Lion's Gate from within. He reports heavy fighting in the streets, but his men are advancing. How far? To the Market Road, as of the last messenger. There is a crossroads some distance in, where the Market Road meets the Street of Steel. The defenders have been setting ambushes along every approach, but our numbers are telling. Stannis nodded once. He knew the layout of King's Landing well enough, from the years he had spent there as Robert's master of ships, years when the city had felt less like a home than an obligation he could not escape. The Street of Steel ran north to south through the heart of the lower city, and the crossroads Massey described sat near enough to the King's Gate that taking it would open the city's interior to his advance. From there his men could push in multiple directions, north toward the Red Keep, west toward the Mudgate to take it from within, or east toward the Iron Gate. Tell Lord Caron to secure the crossroads and hold it, Stannis said. He is not to advance further until he has word from me. Massey hesitated for only a heartbeat. My lord, if the men push now while the defenders are still reeling. He is not to advance further until he has word from me, Stannis repeated, his tone unchanged. Massey gave a short bow and rode off. Stannis understood the instinct. Push an enemy while they were disordered, before they could consolidate, before fresh men could be brought to bear. It was sound enough thinking for a skirmish. But King's Landing was not a skirmish. A city taken too quickly, with men scattered down a dozen alleys and side streets, became a city easy to lose again. He needed his men concentrated, not spilled across the interior like water poured on dry ground. When he moved them forward, he would move them together. He turned his attention back to the battle unfolding below. The fighting at the Mudgate had grown louder in the last minutes. He could hear the sound of it clearly now over the general din, the distinctive crash of steel on shields, the rhythmic impact of the ram, and beneath it all the ragged human noise of men fighting in close quarters where there was no room for technique and survival depended entirely on will. His men at the Mudgate had suffered more than anywhere else today. The approach was narrow, little more than a strip of ground between the wall and the river, and the defenders had made them pay for every yard of it. He would remember the men who had died there, even if their names were never recorded anywhere. Something on the parapet above the Mudgate caught his eye. He raised his spyglass. At first he thought it was a trick of the fading light, for the sun was sinking steadily now toward the western horizon, painting the smoke-thickened sky in shades of amber and deep red that made distances difficult to judge. But it was no trick. There was a figure atop the wall, standing where the battlements had been partially torn away by the catapult fire, fighting alone against the press of his men who had scaled the ladders and gained the parapet. The man was enormous. Even at this distance and in the dying light, the sheer scale of him was plain. He stood a full head taller than the soldiers around him and was broader across the shoulders than two ordinary men set side by side. He wore white, or had worn white, the cloak was darkened now with soot and blood, but the color beneath was unmistakable. Kingsguard. Stannis watched through the glass as the giant in white turned to meet the soldiers rushing him along the parapet. His movements were not the fluid, practiced economy of a trained swordsman. They were something rawer than that, the sheer, terrible efficiency of a man too large and too strong to require technique. A swing of his hammer sent one of Stannis' men sprawling back into the men climbing the ladder below him. He caught another by the gorget with his free hand and threw him bodily from the wall. A third came at him from the left and the White Knight turned and drove his elbow into the man's helm hard enough that Stannis could almost hear the impact from here. His men fell back from the giant, bunching away from the Kingsguard, uncertain. Then one of them raised a crossbow and loosed a bolt at near point-blank range. The White Knight staggered but did not fall. His warhammer came around in a short arc and caved in the crossbowman's helm. Stannis lowered the glass. He did not know the man. At this distance, in this light, through the smoke, it was impossible to see any identifying information. It did not matter who he was. What mattered was that he was holding the parapet above the Mudgate almost alone, buying time for the men within to rally, and doing it with a ferocity that was costing Stannis soldiers he could not easily replace. He would note the man's name, when he learned it. A man who fought like that deserved to be remembered, even by his enemies. He lowered the glass and stared at the parapet a moment longer before his thoughts turned, as they had not since he had ordered her carried back to the tents, to Melisandre. Her collapse troubled him in ways he had not expected. Not because he had come to rely upon her powers, though he would not pretend the matter of the wildfire and what she had done to it was easily set aside. What troubled him was the doubt he had seen in her eyes before the battle began. He had told himself it meant nothing. Melisandre doubted, as all people doubted, and the flames were no more reliable a source of intelligence than a scout who had ridden too many hours without sleep. The victory she had promised him was still within his grasp, and he intended to take it on his own terms regardless of what her fires showed or did not show. He looked north, toward the Iron Gate. The transport ships carrying his 3,000 would have landed hours ago, somewhere along the shore. Whether they had made it to the gate and forced it was another question. He had received no word. "Your Grace." A different voice this time. Sir Roland Storm, breathing hard, his horse lathered at the flanks. A report from the scouts ordered to watch the approaches to the north. Stannis looked at him fully. Something in the knight's tone pulled at his attention in a way that Mass's report had not. "Speak plainly." "Lannister banners, Your Grace." Sir Roland's voice was steady but his jaw was tight. "Spotted coming along the Rosby Road. A large force." The scouts could not get close enough to count but they describe a long column. They could see it stretching back beyond the last rise before the road bends east. The word settled over Stannis like cold water. He had known this was possible. Had known it and had driven his men through the night on half rations because he knew it was possible. He had not arrived too late, the city was cracking open before him, gate by gate. But Tywin Lannister had not been held in the Riverlands as Melisandre's flames had first promised, and now the Lord of Casterly Rock was coming down the Rosby Road with what sounded like the full strength of his host. Stannis made no sound. He sat on his horse and looked northeast, toward the thin line of smoke that hung in the sky above the distant tree line, and he thought. Tywin Lannister. 15,000 men, perhaps more. His own forces were committed here, split between 3 assault points, with thousands already inside the city. His fleet was devastated, the Blackwater Rush still stinking of wildfire and the hulls of burned ships. If the Lannister host arrived in strength while his men were scattered up on the walls and through the streets of a half-taken city, it would not be a battle. It would be a slaughter conducted at his expense. He ran the numbers the way he always had, without sentiment, without comfort, the same way he had once tallied grain stores during sieges, or counted the dead after hard-fought skirmishes. It was a discipline he had learned early, that the numbers did not lie, and that a man who refused to look at them clearly always paid more in the end than one who faced them honestly from the start. The city was falling. That much was true. The King's Gate was his, the Mudgate had just given way, and if the Lion's Gate breach widened sufficiently in the next hour, he would have a third entry point. His men were in the streets. They were advancing. Somewhere in those streets the last defenders of Joffrey Baratheon were making what stands they could, fighting and dying and buying the boyking whatever time they were able to purchase with their lives. None of it would matter if Tywin Lannister's forces arrived and struck his rear while he was committed to the assault. He thought of the bridge. The stone bridge over the Blackwater Rush, the only crossing at this point of the river, was behind him. His men inside the city could not retreat across it quickly. An army extracting itself from house to house fighting in a hostile city was not an army, it was a mob. If the Lannister host arrived in the next 2 hours and pressed hard from the northeast while his men were fighting in the interior, he would lose not a battle but his entire campaign. He thought of Storm's End, of 14 months with the smell of rotting leather and boiled belt in his nose, of men dying slowly, of things that had nothing to do with swords. He had held then. But holding was a different proposition than what he faced now. He had held because there was nowhere to retreat to, and because surrender had never been a word he could fit in his mouth. This was not the same. This was a calculation, and the calculation was telling him something he did not want to hear. If he stayed, and Tywin arrived in force before the city was fully secured, he risked everything. His army. His campaign. His claim. If he retreated now, he lost the city. He lost the ground he had taken at such cost, the men who had died on the Blackwater and before the gates, the ships burning in the rush. He would lose ground. But he would not lose his army. An army could take another city. A broken army could not. How far, he asked at last, his voice flat and carrying no emotion that he intended to give away. Sir Roland understood at once what he was asking. 2 hours, your grace. Perhaps less, if they are marching at speed. 2 hours. The sun was nearly gone now, its last light bleeding out along the horizon and casting long shadows across the battlefield. What remained of the day was dying fast, and with it the light his men needed to fight and maneuver and withdraw in any kind of order. Darkness would be as dangerous to a retreating army as Lannister steel, perhaps more so. He had less time than he had thought. His men at the crossroads near the Street of Steel were fighting in the streets this very moment. The mud gate was about to fall. The breach near the Lion's Gate still needed widening. 2 hours was not enough to finish killing the defenders in the city and then getting his men in formation and setting up their own defenses. It was not close to enough. He looked at the city. At the smoke rising from within the walls, black against a darkening sky. At the banners of the crowned stag flying from the King's Gate's parapet. At all of it, held and fought for and paid for in the lives of his men. "Send word to Lord Caron," Stannis said. "His men are to pull back through the King's Gate immediately. Any man not out within the half-hour is to be left behind. Send the same order to the Mud Gate. They are to fall back and reform on the southern bank." He paused. "The siege engines are to be moved first. I will not leave them for Tywin Lannister." Sir Roland stared at him for just a moment, the surprise plain on his face before the discipline asserted itself. "And the men at the Lion's Gate, your grace?" Stannis had already turned his horse. "Have them form ranks in front of the bridge. They will cover the withdrawal." He rode south along the high ground, back toward the bridge, issuing orders as he went with the same flat precision he had applied to everything today. The catapults first. Then the infantry reserves. Then the men pulling back from the gates. It would be a difficult withdrawal, the kind that could turn ugly if panic set in, and he would ride among the men himself if that was what it took to prevent panic from setting in. He was not a man who inspired affection in those who served him, he knew this and had long since made his peace with it. But they did not need to love him. They needed to move when he told them to move. He had been close. He had gotten farther than any man since the sack. And that had only happened because the gates were opened from within. Close was not enough. He would retreat. He would reform. He would count his dead and feed his men and rest his horses, and he would look at the numbers again with the same cold clarity he always brought to them. And then, when the numbers told him it was time, he would come back. The Iron Throne was still his by right. A retreat did not change that. Nothing could change that. He rode south, toward the bridge, as darkness settled over King's Landing and the smoke of the black water rose to meet the first cold stars of evening. The end.